I am Blair, 30 years old, and I carry a very dark secret written permanently on my skin. 12 years ago, during a house fire, my father physically pushed me back into the flames so he could grab my brother's hand instead. As the thick black smoke filled my lungs, I heard my mother say with absolute freezing ice in her voice that they simply could not ever risk losing their son. They walked out and left me to turn to ash. But they had no idea I survived. I built an empire from those ashes. And today I am watching them beg the very daughter they murdered for a lifeline. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to look your abusers in the eye and refuse to back down. The Manhattan law office on the 40th floor smelled of polished mahogany and desperate old money. I sat perfectly still in a high-back leather chair, keeping my posture rigid. My high-necked cream silk blouse deliberately concealed the faded burn scar stretching across my collarbone. That scar was a permanent souvenir from the night my parents decided my life was worth sacrificing for my older brother Spencer. I looked across the massive conference table at Thomas and Cynthia. I had stopped calling them Mom and Dad. Thomas paced near the floor-to-ceiling windows. He looked older now, but his arrogant entitlement remained intact. Cynthia sat directly across from me wearing a designer suit. Her face displayed the calm, calculated mask she had worn my entire life. Suddenly, Thomas turned on his heel and marched back to the table. He slid a blue legal folder forcefully across the polished wood, stopping inches from my hands. "Sign it, Blair," he demanded, his voice echoing with the same aggressive authority he used when I was a child. "We do not have all day to sit here and coddle your stubbornness." I looked down at the document without touching it. It was the deed of transfer for my grandfather's last remaining real estate trust. My grandfather was the only person in the family who ever treated me with true dignity, leaving this specific commercial parcel strictly to me and bypassing Thomas entirely. It was completely paid off. For years they had ignored my existence until this very morning. I raised my eyes to meet my father's gaze, asking him why I would ever sign over the only thing my grandfather left me. "Because Spencer is drowning," Thomas snapped, leaning over the table to intimidate me. "His investment firm is on the verge of total bankruptcy. Creditors are circling like vultures. If he does not secure a massive capital injection by the end of the week, he loses the company and his reputation. We will use your real estate trust as collateral to secure a bridge loan. It is the only way to save your brother." The sheer audacity of his demand hung in the air. He was asking the daughter he left to burn to hand over millions of dollars to save the golden boy. Cynthia leaned forward, giving me a look of feigned maternal patience that made my stomach turn. "Blair, be reasonable," she said, her voice dropping into a cold, manipulative register. "What do you even need this kind of asset for? You have your little computer consulting gig. A woman with your modest lifestyle does not require commercial real estate. Spencer is a prominent figure in the financial sector. His reputation depends on this bailout. He carries the family legacy. You need to stop being selfish and think about the greater good of this family." I stared at her, letting her words wash over me. My little computer consulting gig. That was how she dismissed my life. They had no idea that my consulting gig was actually a highly classified cyber forensics firm. They did not know my net worth eclipsed their generational wealth 10 times over. I looked at the blue folder again. I thought about the smoke burning my eyes and the heat blistering my skin. I remembered reaching out for my father's hand and feeling him shove my shoulder backward so he could grab Spencer instead. I remembered Cynthia pulling Spencer toward the door without a single glance back at me. They wanted me to sacrifice my inheritance to save the brother who was the reason for my scars. I picked up the gold pen resting next to the document. Thomas let out a heavy sigh of relief, believing I was submitting to their authority. Cynthia smiled, a tight, victorious smile, adjusting her expensive watch. I held the pen over the signature line. The silence in the room was absolute. Then I calmly placed the pen down and pushed the blue folder back across the wood toward Thomas. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it carried the weight of 12 years of suppressed rage. Thomas turned purple. "What do you mean, no?" he yelled, slamming his fist on the table. "You are going to sign this document right now. You owe this family." I do not owe you anything, I replied, keeping my posture perfectly relaxed. Spencer's massive financial failures are entirely his own. If his firm is bankrupt, he can deal with the consequences. I am not setting myself on fire to keep your golden boy warm. Not again. Cynthia stood up her chair, scraping loudly against the floor. You ungrateful little brat, she hissed, her mask of patience completely shattered. We gave you everything. We raised you. Sign that trust over to your brother, or I swear you will regret it. I remained seated, observing their desperation. They thought I was still that terrified teenager choking on smoke. They did not realize I was no longer their victim. I was the architect of their ruin, and this refusal was only the first move. The heavy oak door of the conference room swung open with a sharp click, shattering the tense silence I had just created. High heels clicked against the marble floor with aggressive rhythm. Jasmine stepped into the room, bringing a cloud of suffocatingly expensive perfume with her. My sister-in-law was a vision of weaponized wealth. As a Black African-American woman who had married into my family 5 years ago, she had eagerly adapted to their toxic brand of elitism. Today she was dripping in designer labels from head to toe. Diamond tennis bracelets stacked on her wrists caught the harsh fluorescent lighting of the law office, sparkling with every exaggerated movement she made. She wore a tailored tweed blazer that cost more than most people made in a year. It was a spectacular display of financial denial. Her husband's investment firm was allegedly hemorrhaging cash bleeding dry from every corporate artery. Yet Jasmine was parading around in fresh couture, funded by the very company that was supposedly bankrupt. She walked right past me without a single glance of greeting and took a position standing behind Thomas, placing one perfectly manicured hand on his shoulder in a show of unified family solidarity. Are we really still dealing with this? Jasmine sighed. She looked down her nose at me. I thought you would have signed those papers by now, Blair. Spencer is practically working himself to the bone trying to keep everything afloat, and you are sitting here playing games with a useless piece of dirt. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not blink. I did not shift my weight. I just watched her. You have always been so incredibly selfish, Blair. Jasmine continued, stepping out from behind Thomas to pace along the length of the conference table. It honestly sickens me. Your parents invite you here, treat you with respect, and ask for a simple favor to help your own flesh and blood. And you sit there acting like they are asking you to cut off your arm. You have absolutely no concept of family loyalty. You never have. You only care about yourself and that pathetic little computer consulting firm of yours. The hypocrisy of her words was almost poetic. Family loyalty. They loved throwing that phrase around when they needed something to drain from me. They demanded loyalty, but offered none in return. They demanded sacrifice, but only when I was the one doing the bleeding. Jasmine stood there wearing thousands of dollars of jewelry bought with stolen money, lecturing me about being selfish, because I refused to hand over my grandfather's last remaining legacy to cover her husband's failures. I kept my expression completely blank, absorbing her insults like stone absorbing rain. I refused to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. I refused to let her see that her words meant absolutely nothing to me. You do not even need the land, Jasmine sneered, leaning over the table so her face was level with mine. What are you going to do with it? You live a completely unremarkable life. Spencer is building a legacy. He employs hundreds of people. His reputation in the financial district is spotless. He actually matters to the world. You are just holding on to this trust fund out of pure spite because you have always been jealous of him. You have always resented the fact that your parents knew he was destined for greatness, while you were destined to be entirely mediocre. Cynthia nodded along with Jasmine's rant, looking incredibly pleased with her daughter-in-law. Thomas crossed his arms, looking at me as if I were an insect that needed to be squashed. They were a united front of entitlement and delusion. And the funniest part is Jasmine added, flipping her long hair over her shoulder and flashing a triumphant smile. Spencer does not even really need your pathetic little handout permanently. It is just a temporary measure, a short-term leverage tool to satisfy some overly anxious creditors for a few days. She paused for dramatic effect, clearly dying to brag about her husband's supposed genius. Spencer is on the absolute verge of landing a massive bailout, she announced, her voice ringing with arrogant pride. An anonymous corporate conglomerate has already shown massive interest in acquiring his debt and restructuring the firm. We are talking tens of millions of dollars in fresh capital. They recognize his brilliance. They know his firm is a gold mine waiting to be capitalized on. The deal is practically finalized. Once that cash injection hits the accounts by the end of the week, he will not even need your grandfather's little plot of land. He can buy 10 of them just like it. So sign the paper, stop acting like a victim, and do something useful for once in your miserable life. An anonymous conglomerate. The words echoed in my mind, ringing with a loud metallic irony. My stoic mask did not slip, but internally, a dark, cold amusement spread through my chest. Jasmine was bragging about the anonymous corporate conglomerate coming to save them. She was bragging about the massive influx of cash that was going to rescue Spencer's sinking ship. She had absolutely no idea that I was the sole founder, owner, and CEO of that exact anonymous conglomerate. She had no idea that I held all of Spencer's debt, that I held the keys to their destruction, and that the bailout she was so proudly flaunting was actually the final nail in their coffin. I had orchestrated the entire acquisition. I was the one holding the leash they were so eager to put around their own necks. I looked at Jasmine's smug, triumphant face. I looked at Cynthia's cold, approving eyes. I looked at Thomas's impatient, demanding posture. They were entirely oblivious to the trap closing around them. They thought they had cornered a helpless animal, completely unaware that they had walked straight into a lion's den. I slowly reached out and placed my hand on the gold pen resting beside the blue legal folder. Jasmine let out a small, satisfied huff, assuming she had successfully bullied me into submission. Cynthia relaxed her shoulders. Thomas took a step forward, eager to snatch the signed document away. Instead of picking up the pen, I placed my index finger against the side of it. With one smooth, deliberate motion, I pushed the pen across the polished mahogany table. It rolled away from me, stopping right at Jasmine's fingertips. Then I placed both of my hands flat on the table and looked directly into Thomas's eyes. I am going to say this exactly one time, I stated, my voice completely devoid of emotion, sharp and cold as shattered glass. I will never sign over my grandfather's land to cover Spencer's incompetence. I do not care about his reputation. I do not care about his creditors. And I certainly do not care about your fabricated concepts of family loyalty. The answer is no. Today the answer will be no tomorrow. And the answer will be no until the day you die. The trust remains mine. The silence that followed was deafening. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Jasmine's jaw actually dropped open in shock. Thomas's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Cynthia looked as though she had been physically struck. They were utterly paralyzed by my absolute refusal. I sat back in my chair, turning my gaze away from my furious family. I looked toward the large glass window at the far end of the conference room. I looked toward the man who had promised to stand by my side through anything. I looked at my husband Gavin, waiting for him to step forward and defend me against this ambush, waiting for him to honor the vows he had made to me. But as Gavin stepped away from the window and walked toward the table, the cold, calculating look in his eyes told me that the betrayal in this room had only just begun. The silence in the room shifted as I kept my eyes locked on Gavin. For 5 years, he had been my anchor. Just that morning over coffee, he kissed my forehead and promised we would present a united front against my toxic family. I waited for him to step forward and intervene. I waited for the man I married to tell my father the discussion was over and we were leaving immediately. Instead, the rhythmic sound of his shoes crossing the floor felt like a countdown to an execution. He did not walk toward me. He walked entirely around the massive mahogany table, distancing himself from me with every calculated step. He stopped right beside Jasmine, his shoulder almost brushing against her tailored blazer. He looked down at me with an expression of complete indifference. There was no familiar warmth left in his eyes. There was only a hollow emptiness that made the blood run ice cold in my veins. My mother let out a sharp breath and my father crossed his arms, leaning back as if preparing to watch a theatrical performance unfold. They knew. The realization hit me with the staggering force of a physical blow. They all knew exactly what was about to happen. This was not a negotiation about real estate. This was a coordinated firing squad. Gavin set his black leather briefcase on the polished wood surface. the sharp click of the metal clasps echoing loudly in the stifling room. He reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound by a heavy clip. He did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He did not show a single ounce of remorse. He threw the stack directly onto the center of the table, right on top of my grandfather's sacred trust deed. The papers slid across the slick surface, stopping mere inches from my folded hands. I did not need to read the bold print at the top of the first page to know what they were. The timing of this brutal ambush was flawlessly cruel. "Sign the divorce papers, Blair." Gavin said, his voice entirely devoid of any affection or basic human decency. "I am done playing this tedious game with you." I looked from the thick legal papers to his face, searching for any remaining trace of the man I loved. He simply adjusted his designer tie and stared back with a terrifying sense of absolute entitlement. "We are dissolving this marriage," he continued, his tone sharp and unwavering, effectively immediately. "And since you are choosing to be completely unreasonable today and withholding assets that could benefit people who actually matter, I am taking what is legally owed to me. I expect full alimony and a complete 50% ownership stake in your worthless little IT firm to be transferred to my name by the end of the month. You have wasted the best years of my youth playing the tragic victim and hiding your scarred body from the real world. I deserve heavy financial compensation for enduring your miserable presence and your pathetic refusal to support your own flesh and blood." A sickening wave of nausea washed over me, but I forced my spine to remain perfectly straight against the leather chair. I adamantly refused to let them see me bleed today. Jasmine let out a low, delighted laugh, covering her mouth in a mock display of sympathy. Thomas actually smiled, a genuine wide smile of predatory victory. They had orchestrated this entire morning specifically to break my spirit. If the emotional manipulation regarding my brother Spencer did not force my hand, they knew the sudden devastating destruction of my marriage would leave me shattered and incredibly vulnerable. They fully expected me to break down sobbing right there in the law office. They expected me to beg Gavin to stay and to offer them the real estate trust in exchange for keeping my husband around. They wanted me to bargain with my grandfather's legacy just to hold on to a man who viewed me as nothing more than a convenient stepping stone. The sheer audacity of their coordinated attack was truly breathtaking. I was entirely surrounded by enemies, sitting alone in a room with 5 people who desperately wanted to strip my bones bare and leave me to scavenge for scraps. I looked at the divorce papers, then back up at Gavin standing proudly beside my family. He arrogantly wanted half of my worthless IT firm. The cosmic irony of his loud demand almost made me smile. He genuinely thought he was demanding half of a struggling computer repair shop that barely made payroll each month. He was legally demanding half of CipherCore, a digital empire worth more than everything in this room combined. But he did not know that fact. None of them did. They thought I was a scarred woman desperately clinging to a failing business venture. They thought they held all the power. I stood up slowly, taking my time to smooth out the front of my silk blouse. I did not reach for the gold pen. I did not shed a single tear for the death of my marriage. I picked up my handbag and looked intensely at my parents, my brother's obnoxious wife, and the man who had just betrayed my entire existence. The boiling tension in the room suddenly felt like raw fuel pumping through my veins. They had wanted to burn me down again. Instead, they had just handed me the match. "I will see you all in court," I said, my voice dangerously soft, but carrying a lethal promise. I turned my back on them and walked out of the law office, the heavy oak doors shutting firmly behind me, severing my ties to that room forever. I walked straight toward the elevators, knowing my next stop was the penthouse I shared with Gavin to gather my belongings. I had a ruthless war to wage, and the battlefield was about to shift entirely. The elevator ride down from the 40th floor felt like a descent into a completely different reality. I stepped out of the pristine mahogany lobby and into the bustling noise of the busy Manhattan streets. The crisp afternoon air hit my face, but I barely registered the dropping temperature. My mind operated with the cold precision of a machine, actively processing the coordinates of a newly formed battlefield. I flagged a passing yellow taxi and immediately gave the driver the address to the luxury penthouse I shared with Gavin. It was our sanctuary, or so I had foolishly believed today. The ride across town was a blur of flashing traffic lights and blaring sirens. When the vehicle finally stopped outside our sleek, high-rise building, I paid the fare using cash and marched straight past the doorman. I ignored his usual polite greeting entirely. My heels struck the marble floor of the lobby with intense purpose as I headed straight for the private elevator. I swiped my resident pass and pressed the button for the top floor. The metal doors glided shut, sealing me inside the perfectly quiet metallic box as I was propelled upward toward my own personal home. Stepping out of the elevator into the private vestibule, I reached into my designer bag and pulled out the heavy magnetic keycard. I held it flat against the electronic lock on the heavy oak door, expecting the familiar soft green glow and the satisfying click of the deadbolt retracting. Instead, the security panel flashed a solid, angry crimson red. A harsh error tone buzzed through the quiet hallway. Frowning, I wiped the card against my silk sleeve and tried to scan it a second time. The red light blinked again, denying me entry into the large property I legally owned. I raised my fist and pounded loudly on the solid wood. Within seconds, the locks disengaged from the inside and the door swung inward. Gavin stood there blocking the entryway with his broad shoulders. He had beaten me back to the apartment and clearly used the extra time to orchestrate his next attack. He held a glass of dark amber whiskey in one hand, looking ridiculously arrogant. The smug grin twisting his face was a sickening contrast to the loving expression he had worn just hours earlier. I pushed past his shoulder and stepped into the sprawling, open modern foyer. The sight before me halted my momentum completely. The pristine, minimalist living room was virtually unrecognizable. Dozens of large, brown, cardboard moving boxes were stacked haphazardly against the expensive floor-to-ceiling glass windows. My expensive clothes, shoes, artwork, and personal belongings were shoved inside them with zero regard for care or organization. My silk dresses were crumpled alongside heavy winter boots. The carefully curated existence I had built here was dismantled and crammed into cheap corrugated paper. Gavin walked up slowly behind me, taking a deliberately slow sip of his whiskey before speaking in a highly mocking cold tone. "I took the absolute liberty of packing your trash up for you," he announced, gesturing lazily toward the mountain of messy cardboard. "I am changing the locks formally tomorrow morning, but I thought it would be much cleaner if you simply dragged your pathetic garbage out right now." I spun around to face him, staring at the stranger wearing my husband's skin. "You cannot legally evict me from my own marital residence," I stated plainly. "It takes months for a court to finalize property division and order an eviction." Gavin chuckled, a dark, bitter sound echoing through the empty space. "You really think I care about the slow legal process?" he mocked, taking another sip of his expensive drink. "You have absolutely no resources left to fight me, Blair. Every single dime from our joint checking and shared savings accounts is gone. I drained them entirely an hour before that lovely family meeting. I wired every last available cent directly into Spencer's holding company. He needed the liquid capital immediately, and since you were acting so incredibly stubborn about the land, I took the initiative to contribute our shared wealth to a cause that actually guarantees a truly massive return." I felt my jaw clench tightly. "You stole my money to fund my brother's failing criminal enterprise," I demanded, stepping closer. Gavin slammed his glass down hard on the kitchen island, shattering the crystal base. The golden liquid spilled across the white marble. "Do not act so self-righteous, you damaged little freak," he screamed, stepping aggressively into my personal space. "I put up with your cold, emotionless personality for 5 agonizing years. I pretended to love you while constantly forcing myself to look past those absolutely hideous burn scars stretching across your skin. You are completely and physically repulsive." His vicious words were explicitly designed to completely shatter my confidence. He wanted to break me down exactly the way my parents had always tried to destroy my self-worth. "Every single time I ever touched your disfigured shoulder, I felt completely sick to my stomach." Gavin hissed cruelly, pointing a sharp finger directly at my chest. "I stayed because I assumed you would eventually inherit the family fortune. But since you are completely intent on ruining Spencer and burning every bridge, you have no actual value left. I am officially tossing you out onto the literal street starting today. He leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest, radiating a sickening aura of unearned victory. You have absolutely nothing left to fight me with, he gloated loudly. The legal system moves slowly, and by the time any judge hears your pathetic divorce case, you will be entirely bankrupt and homeless. I plan to completely bury you in court fees until you finally break. I stood absolutely still, absorbing the intense venom spewing from his mouth. Gavin firmly believed he had completely outsmarted me. He truly thought I was utterly defenseless. He was about to be proven catastrophically wrong soon. The heavy silence following Gavin's cruel declaration was suddenly broken by a soft click echoing from the hallway. The custom frosted glass door to our master bedroom swung open with a slow, deliberate creak. I shifted my gaze past Gavin's shoulder. A figure stepped out into the corridor, bathed in the warm ambient light of the afternoon sun filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was Jasmine. She strolled casually into the main living area carrying a crystal flute filled with pale, bubbling champagne. My eyes immediately dropped to what she was wearing. It was my custom-tailored ivory silk robe. The intricate lace detailing along the cuffs and hem fluttered gently as she walked completely barefoot across the heated hardwood floors. The garment had been a private anniversary gift purchased during a trip to Milan, but now it was casually draped over the shoulders of my brother's wife. She took a slow, appreciative sip from the delicate crystal glass, letting the expensive vintage wash over her tongue before flashing me a brilliantly wicked smile. Jasmine moved with the languid grace of a feline that had just swallowed the canary. She walked straight to Gavin, wrapping one arm around his waist and pressing her cheek against his shoulder. He did not pull away. Instead, he reached out and casually rested his hand on the small of her back, pulling her flush against him. The sheer grotesque intimacy of the gesture answered 1,000 questions I had never even thought to ask. The puzzle pieces rapidly arranged themselves in my mind, locking together with sickening precision. You really should see the look on your face right now, Blair. Jasmine purred, taking another leisurely sip of champagne. It is absolutely priceless. You look like you have just seen a ghost. Or perhaps you are just realizing that you have been playing checkers, while the adults in the room have been playing chess. I stared at the two of them standing amidst the wreckage of my packed belongings. 2 years, Gavin stated, proudly answering the silent question hanging in the air between us. 2 entire years of sneaking around right under your incredibly oblivious nose. And under Spencer's too, for that matter. You and your golden boy brother are both so wrapped up in your own pathetic little worlds that neither of you ever bothered to look at what was happening right inside your own homes. Jasmine laughed, a high-pitched tinkling sound that grated against the walls of the penthouse. Spencer is a complete fool, she scoffed, rolling her eyes. He thinks I am at the spa, or out shopping with the wives of his board members, while I am actually here lying in your incredibly comfortable custom bed. But do not worry, Blair. We are not just taking your husband and your luxury apartment. We have a much grander design in motion. She stepped away from Gavin and began to pace around the kitchen island, running her fingers lightly over the cool marble countertop. You see, Spencer's company is not just failing organically, Jasmine explained, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. It has been receiving some very targeted help. Gavin has been utilizing his brilliant financial access to quietly siphon off crucial investment funds. And that massive anonymous bailout Spencer is currently celebrating. That influx of cash your parents are so desperate to secure. We have already established the necessary shadow accounts to intercept every single dollar of it. Gavin picked up the narrative, his chest puffing out with overwhelming arrogance. By the time Spencer realizes his corporate accounts have been entirely gutted, we will be thousands of miles away. The joint bank accounts I drained from you today were just the appetizer. The money I transferred to Spencer's holding firm this morning is already being funneled directly into offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands. We are going to bleed your family legacy completely dry, Blair. Every trust fund, every corporate asset, every hidden reserve. We are taking it all. We will leave Spencer holding the bag for massive corporate fraud, and we will leave you utterly destitute. The magnitude of their greed was staggering. They were not simply having a torrid secret affair. They had formed a parasitic syndicate designed to completely annihilate my family from the inside out. They planned to leave Spencer facing federal prison for embezzlement, while they vanished across international borders with tens of millions of stolen dollars. And they wanted to discard me on the pavement as the opening act of their grand finale. Jasmine raised her champagne flute in a mock toast. "Here is to new beginnings," she declared cheerfully. "We are moving to a private estate in Monaco. No more dealing with your insufferable parents. No more pretending to care about Spencer's fragile ego. And most importantly, Gavin will not have to wake up next to your repulsive scars ever again. We win, Blair. It is really that simple. You lose everything and we ride off into the sunset." Gavin walked over to the corner of the room where a small scuffed carry-on suitcase sat separate from the large cardboard moving boxes. It was an old piece of luggage I had used during my college years. He hooked his foot under the handle and violently kicked it across the floor. The wheels screeched loudly against the hardwood before the bag slammed hard into the tips of my shoes. "There is a change of clothes and your basic toiletries in there," Gavin commanded, pointing a rigid finger toward the front door. "Grab it and get the hell out of my property. If you are not out of this penthouse in exactly 30 seconds, I am picking up this phone and calling the building security to forcefully remove a hostile trespasser. You have no legal right to be here anymore. The keycard is deactivated. The accounts are closed. Your life here is officially over." I looked down at the battered suitcase resting against my feet. I looked at the cardboard boxes containing 5 years of a fabricated marriage. Then I looked at Jasmine lounging in my silk robe, and Gavin standing tall with unearned victory. They were waiting for the breakdown. They were eagerly anticipating the desperate tears, the begging, the frantic realization of my total defeat. I slowly reached down and wrapped my hand around the handle of the small suitcase. The leather was cold against my palm. I stood back up and completely dropped the silent, stoic victim facade I had been wearing since I entered the law office earlier that afternoon. The rigid tension in my shoulders evaporated. A profound, absolute calm washed over my entire body. I looked directly into Gavin's eyes and allowed a slow, genuinely chilling smile to spread across my face. It was a smile completely devoid of warmth, a smile forged in the ashes of the fire they thought I had died in 12 years ago. I gripped the handle of the suitcase, firmly adjusting my posture until I stood with the absolute commanding presence of a woman who owned the very ground they stood on. "Keep this illusion." "Gavin?" I said, my voice dropping to a silken, deadly whisper that reverberated through the vast open space of the penthouse. "Keep the apartment. Keep the cheap champagne. Keep the woman wearing stolen clothes. But remember this moment very carefully, because you just locked yourself in a cage." I turned on my heel, the wheels of the small suitcase gliding smoothly behind me. I did not rush. I walked with the measured, confident stride of an apex predator leaving the territory to the scavengers. I did not look back as I crossed the threshold and stepped into the hallway. The heavy penthouse door clicked shut behind me, sealing them inside their temporary delusion of victory. They thought they had secured their escape route to Monaco with millions in stolen funds. They thought they had outsmarted Spencer and discarded me. They had no earthly idea that every single offshore account they were funneling money into was secretly owned and actively monitored by Cypher Core. They had not stolen my money. They had simply deposited it directly into my personal vault. The game was no longer about defending my grandfather's land. It was about absolute total annihilation. They were celebrating the heist that had actually been orchestrated by their own victim. The sheer pathetic nature of their celebration almost made me pity them. Almost. My heels clicked rhythmically against the hallway floor as I pressed the button for the elevator. The digital numbers above the metallic doors descended rapidly. I pulled my phone from my handbag and opened a heavily encrypted secure messaging application. I tapped out a brief encoded sequence to my lead forensic investigator at Cypher Core, authorizing the immediate lockdown of all external funds being routed through Spencer's compromised firm. The trap was set and the doors were bolted shut. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. The descent began, and with every floor that passed, my resolve hardened into an unbreakable diamond. Gavin and Jasmine thought they had written the perfect tragedy for my life, but they were merely footnotes in the empire I was about to unleash. The elevator doors parted at the lobby level, and I walked past the doorman without breaking my stride. The Manhattan afternoon had cooled significantly, but the chill in the air was absolutely nothing compared to the absolute ice currently running through my veins. A sleek, armored black town car was already idling at the curb, summoned minutes earlier through an encrypted application on my phone. I handed my battered college suitcase to the silent driver, slid into the heavily tinted back seat, and gave a single definitive nod. He knew exactly where we needed to go. We drove away from the glittering residential towers of the Upper East Side and plunged deep into the gritty industrial heart of the financial district. The vehicle eventually descended into an underground parking garage beneath a massive brutalist concrete building. It was a structure entirely devoid of corporate signage, completely invisible, and entirely uninteresting to the average passing pedestrian. It looked like a forgotten archival warehouse or a defunct utility station. That was exactly the point. My family truly believed I spent my days tinkering with basic spreadsheets and fixing broken wireless routers. They firmly believed my entire financial worth was tied to modest hourly invoices and a quiet, unremarkable existence. They could not possibly fathom that the stark concrete fortress towering above me currently housed the central nervous system of a global digital syndicate. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked purposefully toward a solid steel reinforced door at the far end of the subterranean garage level. There were no visible handles, no keyholes, and no traditional security pads, just a smooth, flush metal surface blending seamlessly into the gray wall. I pressed my bare hand flat against a hidden biometric panel embedded secretly within the adjacent concrete. A concealed subsurface scanner instantly mapped my fingerprints, verifying my pulse rate and thermal signature in a fraction of a second. A small recessed screen slid open silently at eye level. I leaned forward, letting the harsh, piercing blue light of the retinal scanner sweep thoroughly across my eye. A mechanized, synthesized voice chimed softly to confirm my exact identity, and the heavy steel door unsealed with a deep, resounding pneumatic hiss. Stepping across the threshold, the drab gray concrete of the parking garage vanished instantly. It was entirely replaced by the immaculate, hyper-modern, and intimidating architecture of Cipher Core. I walked down a stark, brightly lit white corridor lined with bulletproof reinforced glass. The air around me hummed with the low, steady, powerful vibration of massive subterranean server farms and their advanced cooling systems. At the very end of the long hallway, a second set of thick automated doors parted smoothly, revealing the main operations floor. The room was an expansive multi-level subterranean amphitheater of raw, unfiltered digital power. Rows upon rows of curved, massive high-definition screens formed a glowing horseshoe around the sunken center of the room. Global data streams, active threat matrices, and heavily encrypted financial ledgers scrolled endlessly across the glowing monitors in cascading waterfalls of complex information. 50 of the world's most elite cyber forensics experts, ghost hackers and financial tracking specialists, sat at their advanced workstations. These were brilliant individuals quietly poached from top-tier government intelligence agencies and private international defense contractors. They were the absolute best digital operatives in the world, and they answered exclusively and directly to me. This was the pathetic little computer consulting firm my mother had dismissed earlier today with an elitist sneer. This was the worthless IT company Gavin confidently thought he could casually claim 50% of in a messy divorce settlement. Cipher Core was a multi-million-dollar titan that actively secured the digital assets of international banks, sovereign wealth funds, and massive anonymous corporate conglomerates. I had built this impenetrable fortress, brick by digital brick, rising from the literal ashes of the fire my parents had gladly left me to die in. I was its sole anonymous founder and its absolute commanding chief executive officer. As I stepped onto the main operations floor, the usual low, continuous hum of rapid keystrokes and hushed analytical conversations immediately ceased. The analysts and engineers completely stopped what they were doing and stood at attention at their desks. It was not a theatrical demand I had ever made of them, but rather a spontaneous gesture of profound respect they offered willingly. They knew my closely guarded history. They knew exactly what kind of ruthless war I had just declared on the people who shared my blood. My lead forensic investigator, a brilliant and utterly ruthless former intelligence operative named Elias, walked briskly toward me holding a secure encrypted tablet. He did not ask about my emotional state. He did not offer useless platitudes or empty sympathy regarding my dead marriage or my treacherous parents. We operated purely in actionable data and lethal execution. I took my tailored jacket off and handed it to an awaiting assistant, smoothly rolling up the sleeves of my silk blouse. Any lingering trace of the obedient daughter or the scorned betrayed wife was completely and permanently stripped away. I was no longer Blair the tragic victim. I was the architect of my own empire stepping rightfully into my absolute domain. The air in the command center practically crackled with the electric shift in my demeanor. My posture was rigid, my expression carved from stone, and my mind was operating with the terrifying clarity of a general surveying a conquered map. I walked down the short flight of stairs to the raised platform at the center of the room, taking my seat at the primary command terminal. The chair was genuine black leather facing a massive wall of primary overview monitors. Elias stepped up directly beside me, handing over the glowing tablet. The lockdown sequence you authorized from the residential elevator was executed flawlessly. Elias reported tapping a rapid command on the master console to mirror his tablet to the main wall display. The central screen shifted immediately, displaying a highly complex web of financial routing numbers and offshore banking destinations. Gavin and Jasmine's aggressive capital transfers from Spencer's investment firm have been successfully intercepted. Elias continued, pointing to a series of flashing red data packets on the screen. The illicit funds are currently completely frozen within our proprietary ghost accounts. They cannot move a single cent, and they absolutely cannot trace the digital interception back to our servers. To them, the money has simply vanished into thin air. I stared intensely at the flashing numbers on the massive screen. Tens of millions of dollars, the stolen lifeblood of my brother's fraudulent legacy, and the stolen fuel for my husband's grand romantic escape, were now securely locked inside my personal digital vault. There were absolutely no tears threatening to fall from my eyes. There was no suffocating grief clouding my vision or hindering my cognitive processing. I felt absolutely nothing for the miserable people who had repeatedly tried to destroy me. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the polished metal console, my eyes locked firmly on the digital map of their impending ruin. The heavy steel trap had snapped shut perfectly. Now it was simply time to systematically crush them. "Tear them open," I instructed, my voice echoing clearly across the expansive operations floor. Elias did not need to ask for clarification. He tapped a rapid sequence on his tablet, and the entire room erupted into synchronized action. The 50 elite operatives sitting at their curved workstations immediately unleashed a coordinated digital assault. The target parameters flashed across the massive primary monitors, illuminating the room in a harsh, tactical glow. We were launching a simultaneous invasive penetration protocol against Spencer's corporate network infrastructure, and every single personal device registered to Gavin. I sat back in the leather command chair, watching the visual representation of the cyber siege. Spencer's investment firm possessed security measures that would easily deter standard corporate espionage or amateur hackers. They utilized military-grade firewalls, dynamic encryption, and layered authentication protocols. To the outside world, the firm looked like an impenetrable fortress of legitimate financial trading. But CipherCore did not utilize standard tactics. My team deployed proprietary algorithms designed specifically to dismantle elite defenses from the inside out. I watched as the progress bars on the main screen surged forward. The supposedly invincible firewalls surrounding Spencer's servers shattered like brittle glass under the relentless targeted pressure of my operatives. Simultaneously, a secondary team bypassed the biometric locks and two-factor authentication guarding Gavin's private cloud servers and mirrored mobile devices. The man who had mocked my intelligence just an hour ago had foolishly linked his secure communication channels to a commercial network. Within 4 minutes, we had established absolute administrative control over both targets. The extraction phase commenced. Massive streams of raw, unfiltered data began pouring into our servers. The monitors shifted from tactical maps to cascading columns of text, financial ledgers, encrypted emails, and hidden offshore routing numbers. Elias routed the incoming data through our primary decryption engine, translating the chaos into a structured, highly readable format. Filter for shadow accounts and unauthorized internal transfers. I commanded, keeping my eyes locked on the scrolling data. Correlate the dates with Spencer's reported quarterly losses. The supercomputers hummed loudly as they processed the massive data dump. Within moments, the true nature of my family's fabricated empire was laid bare on the central screen. It was not a story of unfortunate market downturns or aggressive competitors squeezing a legitimate business. The reality was profoundly devastating and entirely criminal. Spencer's highly praised investment firm was nothing more than a sophisticated illegal money laundering syndicate. I read through the decoded ledgers, feeling a cold, dark satisfaction wash over me. For years, Spencer had been funneling massive amounts of dirty, illicit cash through his corporate accounts. He disguised the dark money as high-yield venture capital investments and complex real estate acquisitions. He was washing funds for international criminal organizations, utilizing the pristine reputation of our family name to mask the stench of the cartel cash. The recent catastrophic losses that had sent my parents into a desperate panic were not due to economic failure. Spencer had simply lost a massive shipment of illegal funds in a botched transfer, and the dangerous people he was working for were demanding immediate repayment. That was the real reason Thomas and Cynthia had desperately needed my grandfather's clean, unencumbered land. They needed a legitimate asset to liquidate immediately to cover a deadly criminal debt. Pull up Gavin's personal encrypted files. Elias said, his tone deadly serious as he swiped a new document onto the main viewing screen. You need to see the architectural structure of the fraud. I shifted my focus to the new data packet. The horrific truth of my husband's betrayal deepened significantly. Gavin was not just a greedy, opportunistic spouse looking for a quick payout. He was the invisible accountant for the entire illicit operation. The files revealed that Gavin had been meticulously cooking the corporate books for over 3 years. He possessed absolute control over the shadow ledgers, expertly masking the incoming dirty money and creating phantom dividends to keep the regulatory agencies completely blind to the laundering operation. But Gavin had also been playing a highly dangerous secondary game. The decrypted internal communications between Gavin and Jasmine exposed the full depth of their parasitic master plan. Gavin had deliberately engineered the massive financial shortfall that was currently threatening Spencer's life. He had been systematically skimming millions of dollars off the top of the cartel's laundered funds, redirecting the cash into microscopic, untraceable microtransactions that eventually pooled in the offshore accounts I had just frozen. Gavin had manufactured the entire crisis. He stole the dirty money, blamed the missing funds on Spencer's poor market investments, and watched as my family panicked. He and Jasmine had orchestrated the perfect, devastating crime. They intended to let Spencer take the violent fall for the missing criminal funds, while they absconded with the skimmed millions, living in absolute luxury in Monaco. The sheer level of sociopathic calculation was breathtaking. My parents had looked down on me my entire life, praising Spencer as the golden child who carried the family legacy. They worshipped a man who was running a criminal syndicate and warmly embraced a son-in-law who was actively orchestrating their total destruction. Their financial ruin was entirely of their own making, built on a rotting foundation of greed, arrogance, and absolute moral bankruptcy. I watched the undeniable proof of their crimes populate the screens around me. There were detailed chat logs where Gavin mocked Spencer's profound stupidity. There were signed digital authorizations where Spencer knowingly moved millions in illicit cartel cash. There were heavily encrypted spreadsheets detailing every single stolen dollar. They had built a towering house of cards and arrogantly handed me the hurricane to blow it all down. Compile everything, I stated, my voice cutting through the quiet hum of the command center. Every ledger, every email, every forged document, and every offshore routing number. Package it into a single, irrefutable digital dossier. Elias nodded, his hands flying across the tablet. Consider it done. We have enough evidence here to guarantee multiple federal indictments. The SEC, the IRS, and the FBI will have a field day with this intelligence. I leaned back in the command chair, allowing a sharp, ruthless smile to touch my lips. They had demanded I sacrifice my inheritance to save them. They had called me a failure, a disappointment, and a repulsive burden. They had stripped my apartment and tried to throw me out onto the street. But they had absolutely no idea that the woman they discarded was now holding the undisputed power to erase them from society entirely. The extraction was complete, and the filth of their reality was fully exposed in the harsh light of my digital empire. The stark illumination of the central monitors cast sharp shadows across the command platform. We had just completely dismantled the financial illusion of my entire family, but the digital excavation was far from over. I watched the streams of data continuing to cascade down the secondary screens when a sudden sharp alert chimed from a specialized terminal to my left. Elias immediately stepped away from the main console, his eyes narrowing as he analyzed the isolated feed. He tapped rapidly on his screen before looking back at me with an expression of intense, grim concentration. His elite team of data miners had just triggered a deep archival sweep, pulling fragments from the absolute bottom of Gavin's mirrored devices. Buried beneath layers of encrypted financial ledgers was a dormant, heavily corrupted file. It was a secondary cloud backup linked directly to an old cellular device registered to my mother, Cynthia. The timestamp on the file made the air in my lungs turn instantly to ice. It was dated exactly 12 years ago. It was the precise night of the fire that had permanently scarred my body and destroyed my youth. Elias did not hesitate. He routed the heavily corrupted data packet directly into CipherCore's primary audio reconstruction engine. The advanced artificial intelligence algorithms immediately went to work, stripping away a decade of digital decay and static interference. I sat perfectly still in the leather command chair, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. For 12 long, agonizing years, the official story had been a tragic accident. Faulty electrical wiring in the historic walls of the estate had supposedly sparked the inferno. My parents had sworn they tried to reach my bedroom, but the smoke and flames were simply too intense. They claimed they barely escaped with Spencer leaving me trapped in the burning East Wing, until the local fire department finally dragged my unconscious body from the blazing wreckage. I had carried the physical and emotional scars of that night every single day, believing it was a horrifying act of random fate. The reconstruction engine finished its rigorous processing, and a clean audio waveform appeared on the central monitor. Elias routed the playback directly to the secure earpiece resting in my palm. I raised the device to my ear and authorized the playback. The recording began with the chaotic, deafening roar of crackling flames and shattering glass. The ambient noise was terrifying, but it was the frantic human voices cutting through the destruction that made my blood freeze entirely. It was Spencer. His voice was wildly erratic, heavily slurred, and frantic with drug-induced panic. He was screaming hysterically about dropping a chemical burner. He was weeping as he confessed to my parents that the highly volatile narcotics laboratory he had secretly built in the basement of our estate had just violently exploded. The sickening truth poured into my ear with crystal clarity. There was no faulty wiring. There was no tragic electrical short. My golden boy brother, high on his own illicit supply, had accidentally detonated a makeshift chemical lab right beneath our feet. I listened as my father Thomas arrived on the scene, his voice tight with absolute terror, not for his home or his family, but for his son's future. The audio captured Thomas violently shaking Spencer, demanding he calm down. My father quickly realized that when the fire investigators and the police arrived, they would inevitably find the remnants of the illegal drug lab. Spencer would face decades in federal prison for manufacturing narcotics and arson. The family name would be completely destroyed. The legacy would be absolute ash. Then I heard my mother speak. Cynthia's voice was not panicked. It was not filled with the desperate terror of a mother watching her home burn. It was chillingly calm, calculating, and utterly devoid of humanity. She told Thomas they needed a distraction. They needed a tragedy so overwhelming and catastrophic that the local authorities would completely overlook the chemical origins of the fire. They needed a sympathetic scapegoat to dominate the narrative. The audio continued to roll, capturing the heavy, hurried footsteps of my parents, moving swiftly away from the basement and directly toward the east wing of the estate, toward my bedroom. I sat immobilized in the command center as the 12-year-old recording played the sound of heavy oak doors slamming shut. I heard the distinct, heavy metallic slide of a deadbolt locking firmly into place from the outside. They were intentionally sealing me inside the burning corridor. They were actively trapping their own daughter in a blazing inferno to serve as a convenient tragic distraction for the police. As the flames roared louder on the recording, consuming the walls around my childhood bedroom, Cynthia's voice cut through the chaos one final time. Her words were sharp, absolute, and entirely unforgiving. "We can't risk losing our son." The recording abruptly ended, leaving a ringing silence in my earpiece. I slowly lowered my hand, placing the device back onto the console. The ambient hum of the servers felt distant, entirely muted by the roaring storm inside my mind. I reached up and gently traced the thick, raised burn scars stretching across my shoulder and collarbone. For 12 years, I had believed these marks were the unfortunate result of a terrible accident. I had spent my entire adult life trying to forgive my parents for their inability to save me, but they had never tried to save me. They had intentionally condemned me to burn alive. They had offered my life as a sacrificial lamb to protect Spencer's miserable, pathetic existence. Any microscopic fragment of lingering familial loyalty, any tiny ember of mercy that might have still existed deep within my heart, was instantly and permanently extinguished. The cold, analytical CEO who had entered the command center was gone, entirely replaced by a woman consumed by a demand for absolute biblical retribution. My parents had forged a monster in the flames of that fire, and now that monster was finally coming home. I turned my gaze away from the audio waveform and looked directly at Elias. His face was a mask of professional stoicism, but I could see the lethal understanding in his eyes. He knew exactly what had just transpired. "Open a direct encrypted channel to our primary proxy firms on Wall Street," I commanded, my voice resonating with a terrifyingly calm authority. "Instruct our senior acquisitions directors to immediately trace every single dollar of Spencer's illicit debt. I want the names of the cartels, the shadow syndicates, and the private loan sharks demanding repayment for the laundered funds he lost." Elias nodded swiftly, his fingers already flying across his terminal to execute the complex financial maneuvers. Once the debt holders are identified, I continued, my tone dropping to a deadly whisper that carried across the quiet command center. "You will instruct our proxies to buy it all. Purchase every single illicit contract, every broken promise, and every violent threat hanging over my brother's head. Pay whatever premium they demand, and transfer the absolute ownership of that debt directly to CipherCore. By tomorrow morning, Spencer will no longer owe his life to anonymous international criminals. He will owe his life, his freedom, and his entire ruined legacy directly to me. I was going to purchase the very chains that bound my family, and I would drag them straight down into the abyss they had so carefully dug for themselves." Elias confirmed the execution of my final command with a crisp nod as the massive screens around us transitioned to track the rapid acquisition of Spencer's illicit debt. The operation was now fully autonomous, running with the lethal precision of a guided missile. I stood up from the leather command chair, smoothing the front of my blouse. The subterranean fortress had served its purpose for the afternoon, but the true battlefield awaited me above ground. The digital trap was securely fastened around their necks, but I needed to look them in the eyes as the chain pulled tight. I left the humming server farms of CipherCore behind and took the private elevator back to the surface. It was time to step out of the shadows and directly into the blinding spotlight they coveted so desperately. 48 hours later, the Manhattan elite gathered for the annual Metropolitan Arts Philanthropy Gala. The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was a swirling sea of ostentatious wealth, dripping in diamonds and saturated with the cloying scent of expensive perfume. Towering crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant golden glow over the city's most powerful socialites and cutthroat corporate titans. It was the absolute pinnacle of high society, and the exact arena where my parents derived their entire sense of self-worth. Standing near a towering centerpiece of imported white orchids, Thomas and Cynthia were aggressively holding court. They looked like perfectly polished royalty to the untrained eye. My father wore a bespoke tuxedo radiating the false confidence of a man who believed his legacy was safely secured. My mother clutched a glass of vintage champagne, draped in a heavily leveraged diamond necklace, laughing loudly at a joke made by a prominent hedge fund manager. Not far from them, Spencer was eagerly shaking hands, completely oblivious to the fact that his invisible cartel masters had been entirely replaced by his own sister. Gavin and Jasmine were also weaving through the crowd, playing the role of the tragic but resilient newly minted couple. I knew exactly what narrative they had spun for the evening. Cynthia had undoubtedly whispered to her closest confidants that I was away on a private wellness retreat recovering from a sudden mental breakdown. They were actively celebrating my demise. In their arrogant little minds, they pictured me shivering in some cheap roadside motel, sobbing uncontrollably over my ruined marriage and depleted bank accounts. They firmly believed they had successfully excised the ugly defective branch of the family tree, ensuring their unearned prestige would shine untarnished for the rest of the evening. The grand double doors at the top of the sweeping marble staircase opened silently. I stepped out onto the landing and paused, allowing the brilliant ballroom lighting to wash over me. I had not come to hide. I had not come to blend in or apologize for my existence. I had come to conquer. I wore a custom-designed floor-length gown of deep, liquid crimson silk. The fabric clung perfectly to my frame, pooling around my feet like freshly spilled blood. But it was the back of the dress that was explicitly designed to paralyze the room. The crimson silk plunged dramatically low, completely exposing my shoulder blades and the entire length of my spine. I wore absolutely no makeup to conceal my history. The thick, jagged, raised burn tissue that stretched violently across my skin was fully and boldly on display. For 12 years, I had hidden these scars beneath high collars, thick scarves, and carefully tailored blazers. I had allowed my family to dictate that my survival was something grotesque to be ashamed of. Tonight, those scars were my armor. They were a visceral, striking statement of absolute survival in a room filled with people who panicked over a misplaced blemish. I placed my hand on the polished brass railing and began my descent. My posture was impeccably straight and my chin was held high. The clicking of my heels echoed sharply over the classical music playing from the string quartet. A prominent magazine editor standing near the base of the stairs noticed me first. The conversation abruptly died on her lips. The silence spread across the ballroom like a rapid shockwave. Heads turned in unison. In a society obsessed with flawless artificial perfection, my brazen display of raw, traumatic reality was a complete anomaly. But it was not met with disgust. The socialites, politicians, and media moguls were utterly mesmerized by the sheer, unadulterated power radiating from my every step. The jagged flesh across my back caught the chandelier light, looking less like a tragic disfigurement and more like a warrior's hard-won battle standard. Whispers erupted through the crowd, but they were not laced with pity. They were filled with breathless awe. Camera flashes from the society photographers positioned near the entrance began to pop in rapid succession, capturing the exact moment the discarded daughter returned as a queen. The sudden shift in the room's atmosphere finally caught my mother's attention. Cynthia turned toward the staircase, her practiced socialite smile freezing permanently on her face. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her manicured fingers, shattering loudly against the marble floor. Thomas whipped his head around his confident posture, instantly collapsing, as all the blood drained rapidly from his face. They stared at me in absolute, unadulterated horror. They were looking at a ghost who had refused to die in the fire they set. Not far behind them, Gavin physically stumbled backward, bumping into a waiter as his eyes locked onto my crimson gown. Jasmine's jaw dropped open, her smug superiority instantly vaporizing into sheer panic. They had expected a broken weeping victim to quietly accept her banishment into obscurity. Instead, they were forced to watch the entire ballroom part like the Red Sea to make way for my approach. The very people my parents spent decades desperately trying to impress were now staring at me with profound fascination and respect. I reached the bottom of the staircase and walked directly toward the center of the room, moving deliberately into my family's line of sight. I did not glare or scowl. I simply offered them the same chilling, serene smile I had given Gavin in the penthouse. They were completely surrounded by their elite peers, trapped in their own superficial arena, and I had just effortlessly stolen the crown right off their heads. The magnetic pull of the room had shifted entirely in my direction, and my family could not stand the gravitational loss. The frozen horror on their faces quickly melted into a frantic defensive rage. Thomas recovered first, snapping his posture back into rigid lines of false authority. He grabbed Cynthia by the elbow, muttering something sharply under his breath. Together they navigated the parted sea of gawking socialites, moving with aggressive purpose toward the towering 20-tier champagne fountain where I had elegantly anchored myself. Spencer flanked them on the right with Jasmine clinging to his arm, while Gavin trailed a few paces behind, hovering like a coward waiting to see which way the wind would blow. They cornered me against the crystal fountain, the cascading champagne creating a soft rushing sound that contrasted sharply with the violent tension radiating from their bodies. Cynthia did not waste a single second. She recognized that the elite crowd was lingering just at the edges of our circle, eager for high society blood sport. My mother immediately deployed her most dangerous weapon, which was her expertly projected stage voice. "Blair, darling, what on earth are you doing here?" she exclaimed, her tone dripping with a highly calculated mixture of fake maternal concern and lethal condescension. The volume was perfectly calibrated to ensure the surrounding hedge fund managers and art directors heard every single syllable. We were so incredibly worried when the psychiatric facility said you checked yourself out against medical advice. I did not flinch, taking a slow, deliberate sip from a flute of champagne I had lifted from the tower. Cynthia's eyes flashed with pure venom as she noted my absolute lack of reaction. She stepped closer, her expensive perfume suffocating the air between us. "It is completely inappropriate for you to be crashing a gala in your condition." Cynthia continued elevating her voice another fraction of a decibel, "especially after Gavin had no choice but to remove you from the penthouse. We all know how unstable you have been since the divorce, but parading yourself around in front of civilized people when you do not even have a roof over your head is simply pathetic. Are you sleeping in your car, Blair? Or did you finally find a cheap motel that accepts destitute, hysterical women?" The surrounding guests murmured, exchanging hushed, scandalous whispers. Cynthia smiled a tight, triumphant smirk, believing she had successfully rewritten the narrative. She was desperately trying to paint my dramatic entrance as the desperate flailing of a homeless, discarded woman experiencing a severe mental break. She wanted the scars on my back to be viewed not as a symbol of power, but as a glaring symptom of my deeply damaged reality. She wanted the elite attendees to look at me with disgust rather than the awe they had shown just moments prior. Spencer, emboldened by our mother's vicious public execution, stepped forward to deliver his own killing blow. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored tuxedo jacket, puffing out his chest with the hollow arrogance of a man who believed he had just conquered the universe. "You really should leave, Blair," he sneered, his voice laced with absolute contempt. "You thought you could come here and make us look bad. You thought refusing to sign over grandfather's land would somehow break us. You are just as delusional as you are ugly. We do not need your pathetic little inheritance anymore. We do not need anything from a failure like you." Spencer leaned in extremely close, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and unearned victory. "You have absolutely no idea how the real world works," he boasted, his ego inflating to grotesque proportions. "You thought we were drowning, but my firm just secured the ultimate lifeline. A massive, anonymous shadow conglomerate just injected an astronomical amount of clean liquid capital directly into my accounts. They bought out every single one of my distressed liabilities at a massive premium. I am completely clear. The firm is untouchable, and I am richer and more powerful than I have ever been." I stared into my brother's smug, ignorant eyes, keeping my expression entirely placid. The sheer astronomical irony of his boasting was almost intoxicating. Spencer was standing in front of the entire Manhattan elite, arrogantly declaring his invincibility, proudly bragging about the miraculous cash injection that saved his life. He had absolutely no comprehension that the mysterious shadow conglomerate he was worshipping was Cypher Core. He did not realize that I had not saved him from the violent cartels. I had simply bought his leash, and I was holding the collar tightly in my own hands. He was bragging about the very trap that was currently tightening around his throat. Jasmine slithered out from behind Spencer's broad shoulder, her eyes gleaming with malicious delight. She looked me up and down with exaggerated pity, letting her gaze linger mockingly on my exposed scars. "It really is tragic," Jasmine cooed, her voice coated in artificial sugar. "You try so hard to look strong, but you are just broken, Blair. Broken and entirely alone. Maybe you should just go back to whatever gutter you crawled out of before you embarrass yourself any further." As she delivered her venomous little speech, Jasmine subtly shifted her gaze past my shoulder. I caught the movement in my peripheral vision. Gavin was standing a few feet away, pretending to examine a modern art sculpture, but keeping his full attention locked on our confrontation. Jasmine flashed a quick, disgusting, triumphant wink directly at my ex-husband. It was a sickening, silent celebration of their parasitic conspiracy. They honestly believed their master plan had worked flawlessly. They thought Spencer was taking the fall for their stolen millions, and that I was utterly destroyed, left with absolutely nothing, while they prepared to escape to Monaco with their stolen fortune. I stood my ground against the crystal champagne tower, completely surrounded by the toxic, suffocating arrogance of my family. They were verbally decimating me, throwing every insult and lie they possessed to humiliate me in front of the city's most powerful figures. They expected me to shatter, to burst into tears, and flee the ballroom in absolute disgrace. Instead, I let my serene, chilling smile widen just a fraction. I took another slow, elegant sip of my champagne, relishing the crisp, cold taste. I did not need to scream or defend myself against their pathetic public mockery. I was simply watching dead people dig their own graves, and they were enthusiastically handing me the shovel. I held my glass of champagne with casual grace, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to make the air between us turn brittle and sharp. Cynthia's sneer faltered slightly as my gaze swept over her, taking in the heavily leveraged diamonds and the desperate need for validation sweating from her pores. The surrounding socialites leaned in closer, pretending to inspect the floral arrangements while eagerly hanging on to our every word. "Homeless is such a highly subjective term, Mother," I said, my voice carrying a smooth, icy cadence that sliced right through the ambient hum of the gala. "Some people sleep on the streets. Others live in towering estates completely financed by stolen cartel money and rotting foundations. I know exactly where I live, and I know exactly who I am. The real question is how much longer you get to keep your roof when the ground beneath it collapses." Cynthia blinked, her heavily mascaraed eyelashes fluttering in momentary confusion, but before she could formulate a shrill response, I shifted my eyes to Jasmine. I had caught the tail end of her disgusting little exchange with my ex-husband, and I refused to let it slide. "And Jasmine," I continued, my tone dropping into a conversational purr, "you really should be careful about celebrating other people's broken marriages. Sometimes the person you think you are running away with is just carrying a much heavier, much more dangerous set of chains. You think you secured a winning ticket, but you simply tied yourself to a sinking anchor. Isn't that right, Gavin?" Gavin stiffened immediately. The smug expression he had been wearing evaporated as his eyes darted nervously toward the ballroom exit. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, suddenly looking incredibly uncomfortable in his expensive tuxedo. Finally, I turned my full attention to Spencer. He looked like a bloated peacock, entirely too pleased with the miraculous financial rescue he still did not understand. He genuinely believed he had outsmarted international criminals. "You always were incredibly gullible, Spencer," I murmured, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "You stand here bragging about your invincibility, but you have absolutely no idea how the real world operates. You think a shadow conglomerate drops a massive cash injection into a failing illicit laundering syndicate out of the goodness of their hearts. You think the sharks who held your cartel debt just walked away quietly because you are charming. In the real world, nobody saves you for free. They do not rescue you. They buy you." I raised my crystal flute high in the air, the golden liquid catching the brilliant light of the chandeliers above us. "To your newest investor, Spencer," I declared, my voice ringing out with crystal clarity, ensuring the neighboring guests heard every word. "May they have exactly as much mercy on your soul as you have shown to your own family." Cynthia let out a harsh, theatrical scoff, attempting to dismiss my words as the incoherent rambling of a jealous lunatic. She placed a manicured hand on Spencer's arm, her lip curling in disgust. "You are completely unhinged," Cynthia spat, turning her back to me. "Let us go, darlings. We have actual billionaires to entertain. Leave her to her pathetic little delusions." They turned in unison, a smug, victorious phalanx of high society elites, preparing to walk away and leave me in their dust. They believed they had won. They believed the confrontation was over. They did not make it 3 steps. Deep within the breast pocket of Spencer's tailored jacket, a phone vibrated with a sharp, aggressive buzzing sound. A fraction of a second later, Gavin's phone erupted with an identical jarring alert. The simultaneous chiming cut right through their arrogant retreat, echoing loudly against the crystal champagne fountain. Spencer paused, a look of mild irritation crossing his face, as he reached into his jacket. Gavin did the same, pulling his device from his slacks. I remained perfectly anchored in place, watching the exact moment the digital guillotine dropped. Spencer swiped his screen, and his initial annoyance instantly transformed into rigid, unblinking shock. I knew exactly what he was reading. The push notifications from his offshore banking portals were glowing in harsh red letters. Account frozen. Administrative lock initiated. Fraudulent activity detected. Cipher core algorithms had just completely seized control of his entire financial network. Beside him, Gavin was staring at his own screen with an expression of sheer, unadulterated terror. The illicit microtransactions he had skimmed, the millions he had meticulously hidden away for his grand escape to Monaco with Jasmine, were entirely inaccessible. The shadow accounts had been completely locked down, stripped of all administrative access. The funds were gone. Before either man could articulate a single word of panic, their devices chimed again. A priority email alert flashed across their locked screens. It was a direct encrypted communication from the anonymous conglomerate that had just purchased Spencer's criminal debt. I watched closely as Spencer's trembling finger tapped the email open. The message was concise, legally binding, and utterly devastating. The new primary stakeholder of his $15 million debt was officially calling in the entirety of the principal. The grace period negotiated by the previous cartel owners was null and void. The email clearly stated that the shadow conglomerate demanded payment in pure, unencumbered liquid cash. They had exactly 48 hours to transfer the full $15 million. The penalty clause at the bottom of the email was absolute. Failure to comply within the 48-hour window would result in the immediate aggressive legal seizure of all corporate holdings and personal assets. Furthermore, the conglomerate promised to initiate catastrophic federal audits detailing the full extent of the firm's money laundering operations, delivering the evidence directly to the authorities. Spencer's breathing turned shallow and rapid. The smug arrogance that had defined his existence just moments ago vanished completely, replaced by the suffocating realization that he was entirely trapped. He had no cash. His accounts were frozen. The supposed lifeline he had been bragging about was actually a tightly coiled noose, and it was violently jerking him into the air. Gavin looked like he was going to be physically sick. His eyes darted frantically between his frozen banking app and the terrifying email demand. He had engineered the entire crisis to steal the money and run, but now he was locked inside the burning building right alongside my brother. He was ruined. Thomas and Cynthia, realizing something was catastrophically wrong, crowded around Spencer's trembling hands to read the screen. As their eyes scanned the glowing text, the healthy color rapidly drained from their faces, leaving them looking like hollow painted mannequins. The flawless, impenetrable facade of the Wilson Empire was shattering in real time right in the middle of the glittering ballroom, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop it. The sheer shock on their faces at the gala was a masterpiece, but the world did not stop spinning for their despair. The following evening marked the highly publicized launch of Spencer's fabricated mega project. It was a spectacular maritime masquerade designed to reel in a fresh batch of unsuspecting elite investors. The venue was a multi-million-dollar super yacht, currently slicing through the dark, churning waters of the bay. Canceling the lavish event was entirely out of the question. A sudden cancellation would instantly signal financial distress to the very people they were desperately trying to con. They were locked into their own performance, trapped on a floating stage, with the 48-hour deadline bleeding away second by second. I stood on the aft deck, holding a flute of sparkling water, letting the crisp ocean wind whip through my hair. The yacht was a floating palace of absolute excess, featuring multiple infinity pools, a helipad, and expansive decks lined with imported marble. A string quartet played near the bow, while waiters in immaculate white uniforms circulated with silver trays of beluga caviar and vintage champagne. To the hundreds of affluent guests sipping their drinks, the night was a triumphant celebration of Wilson Manufacturing's limitless expansion and brilliant future. To my family, it was a claustrophobic floating prison. We were miles from the shoreline. The deep black water stretched out in every direction, creating an impenetrable barrier. No one could simply walk away. No one could hail a car and flee the approaching consequences. I watched my father and brother from a comfortable distance, leaning against the polished mahogany railing. The pristine facade they had maintained at the gala had completely dissolved. Thomas stood near the starboard rail, his face slick with a heavy sheen of cold sweat. He repeatedly loosened his silk tie, gasping for air, as if the atmosphere itself was suffocating him. He was a man accustomed to absolute control, and the sudden realization that his empire was currently hostage to an anonymous creditor was visibly breaking his mind. Spencer was faring even worse. He was pacing erratically near the outdoor bar, his eyes darting wildly across the oblivious crowd. He checked his phone every 30 seconds, his hands visibly trembling. The frozen accounts and the relentless ticking clock of the $15 million cash demand had pushed him to the absolute brink of psychological collapse. The artificial arrogance that usually puffed up his chest had been punctured, leaving behind a terrified, desperate boy. They were cornered animals, dangerous and highly erratic. Cynthia was sitting on a plush white lounger, desperately downing her third martini. She was trying to maintain a rigid socialite smile, while her eyes betrayed sheer animal panic. She kept glancing at Thomas, waiting for him to produce a miraculous solution that simply did not exist. Gavin was entirely absent from the upper decks. I imagined he was likely hiding in a restroom, hyperventilating over his locked shadow accounts and the evaporation of his illicit nest egg. I took another sip of my water, enjoying the exquisite tension radiating from my family. They were frantically searching for a lifeline, an escape hatch, a scapegoat. They desperately needed someone to blame for the invisible vice crushing their empire. Spencer abruptly stopped pacing, his bloodshot eyes locked directly onto me across the crowded deck. I saw the exact moment his panic crystallized into misdirected rage. He aggressively grabbed our father by the shoulder, pointing a shaking finger in my direction. Thomas snapped his head toward me, his expression twisting into a mask of pure, unfiltered malice. They did not know the full extent of my involvement, but they knew I had stood in that ballroom smiling as their world collapsed. In their desperate, twisted minds, I was the only variable they could still control. I was the punching bag they had always relied upon to absorb their failures, and they needed to hit something. Thomas gave a sharp, subtle hand signal to the heavy-set men in dark suits stationed near the sweeping glass staircase. These were not standard event staff or hospitality coordinators. They were my father's private security contractors, men paid exorbitant salaries to handle the family's dirty work with absolute discretion. 3 of them immediately detached from the shadows and began weaving through the oblivious partygoers, moving with tactical precision. I did not run. There was nowhere to go on a moving ship, and running would only validate their delusional authority. I stood my ground as the 3 towering men surrounded me, entirely blocking my view of the ocean. "Miss Wilson," one of the guards stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble meant only for my ears. "Your father requests your presence immediately." It was not a request. Before I could respond, the largest of the 3 men clamped a massive hand around my upper arm. His grip was bruising and absolute. I shot a harsh glare at him, demanding he release me, but a second guard instantly crowded my other side, effectively pinning me between their massive frames. To the laughing socialites holding their champagne flutes just feet away, it simply looked like the wealthy daughter being escorted by her protective detail. The sheer volume of the live band and the roaring ocean wind completely masked the aggressive nature of my capture. They forced me forward, matching their long strides to my unwilling steps. We bypassed the glittering main salon and headed straight for the restricted crew access doors. The moment we crossed the threshold, the lively sounds of the party were instantly severed. The air grew cold and smelled strongly of polished teak and engine oil. The guards marched me down a narrow spiral staircase descending deep into the bowels of the superyacht. The deeper we went, the heavier the silence became. My father and Spencer were waiting at the bottom of the stairs, their faces cast in harsh shadows by the dim overhead lighting. Spencer was practically vibrating with unhinged fury, his fists clenched at his sides. Thomas simply looked murderous, his eyes completely devoid of paternal warmth. "Get her inside," Thomas snarled, gesturing to a heavy reinforced door at the end of the corridor. The guards shoved me roughly down the hall. I stumbled slightly, but managed to catch my balance before they forced me through the open doorway. The space was a massive VIP stateroom designed for high-stakes private negotiations. It was entirely windowless, featuring thick acoustic paneling on every wall to guarantee absolute privacy. It was a soundproof vault hidden beneath the waterline, isolating us completely from the celebration above. The heavy reinforced door slammed shut behind me with a sickening metallic thud, locking into place. The trap they believed they had set was officially sprung, but they had no idea who was truly locked inside with whom. The metallic thud of the reinforced door echoed with a dull, heavy finality. The soundproof acoustic paneling instantly swallowed the noise, leaving the cabin submerged in a chilling, artificial silence. The roaring ocean wind and the lively string quartet from the upper decks were entirely erased. The air in the room was overly conditioned and smelled sharply of expensive leather and stale adrenaline. To my left, a secondary door connecting to an adjoining private suite clicked open. Gavin and Jasmine stepped out into the harsh, recessed lighting. They had been waiting down here the entire time. Thomas wasted no time on pleasantries. The carefully constructed facade of the distinguished Manhattan patriarch was completely gone, replaced by the desperate, vicious snarl of a cornered predator. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping at the edge of a massive black marble conference table that dominated the center of the cabin. With a violent sweeping motion, he slammed a thick stack of legal documents onto the polished surface. The sharp smack cracked like a gunshot in the deadened space. "Sit down and sign it," Thomas commanded, his voice trembling with a toxic mixture of rage and sheer terror. I slowly approached the table, ignoring his order to sit, and glanced down at the papers. The header was unmistakable. It was a formal, legally binding affidavit of guilt. As my eyes scanned the densely packed paragraphs, the sheer magnitude of their delusion became brilliantly clear. It was a meticulously fabricated confession. The document outlined a massive multi-year money laundering and embezzlement operation, detailing the exact movement of stolen funds through offshore accounts and shell companies. It listed the precise sums of money that had been siphoned from the cartels and the fraudulent accounting methods used to hide the discrepancies. But the most striking feature of the paperwork was the name explicitly printed at the top of the page. Mine. Spencer moved to the opposite side of the table, bracing his hands against the marble, as if to stop himself from physically collapsing. "You are going to take the fall for everything, Blair," he dictated, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. "The missing 15 million, the fraudulent accounts, the shadow liabilities, all of it. You are going to swear under oath that you orchestrated the entire syndicate behind my back. You are going to admit that you used your status as a family member to bypass our security protocols. You stole the money and you lost it. They wanted me to confess to a federal financial crime of astronomical proportions. They wanted to hand me over to the authorities and their anonymous predators on a silver platter. By signing that document, I would be guaranteeing myself decades in a maximum security federal prison, while Spencer and Gavin walked away completely clean. Their hands would be washed of the cartel's blood, and their reputations would be entirely restored. They were eagerly trying to feed me to the wolves to buy their own salvation. I looked from the fabricated confession to my father's flushed, desperate face. You want me to sign away my entire life to cover your catastrophic failures, I stated, keeping my tone perfectly serene and devoid of any fear. You want me to rot in a federal cell so that your unearned prestige remains intact. Why on earth would I ever agree to completely destroy myself for the people who threw me into a fire? Gavin stepped out from the shadows, suddenly finding his courage now that I was outnumbered and locked inside a subterranean vault. He dropped his cowardly posture and adopted a sleazy, threatening stance, pulling his smartphone from his tuxedo pocket. Because if you do not sign that paper right now, Blair Prison is going to be the absolute least of your worries, Gavin sneered, tapping the screen with a predatory smirk. I spent a considerable amount of the money I skimmed hiring a very exclusive, very discreet tech firm on the dark web. They specialize in high-end, hyper-realistic deepfake technology. He took a step closer, his expensive cologne mingling with the cold air of the cabin. I have hours of fabricated video footage featuring your exact likeness, engaging in the most vile, degrading, and highly illegal acts imaginable. It is completely indistinguishable from reality. If you refuse to take the fall for the firm, I will press a single button and unleash a coordinated digital assault. These videos will be blasted to every major media outlet, every prominent social circle, and every corporate contact in Manhattan. I will turn you into a global pariah. You will never be able to show your face in civilized society again. You will be a walking, talking obscenity. Jasmine let out a sharp, cruel laugh that bounced harshly off the padded walls. She glided over to Gavin, wrapping her arms possessively around his waist and resting her chin on his shoulder. She looked at my crimson gown and the exposed tissue on my back with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. You really do not have a choice, Blair. Jasmine mocked, her voice echoing with venomous delight. Look at you. You have no money, no husband, and no future. You are completely useless to this family. Why fight it? Prison is exactly where ugly throwaways like you belong. At least in a cell you will be locked away where nobody has to look at your ruined body. Thomas leaned across the marble table, his eyes wide and manic. We have 48 hours to appease this new investor, Blair. 48 hours before they legally seize everything I have built and trigger a federal audit that will bury this family. I will not let you destroy the Wilson legacy because you are feeling vindictive. You owe this family for keeping you comfortable your entire miserable life. Pick up the pen and sign the document, or Gavin ruins you permanently. Choose right now. They stood in a unified front of absolute moral bankruptcy. There was no line they were not willing to cross, no depth they were not willing to sink to. They had eagerly planned to sacrifice my freedom and my dignity to save their own pathetic, cowardly skins. I stared down at the black ink of the confession, surrounded by their threats and their malice. The air in the room was thick and suffocating with their panic, but my heart beat with a slow, steady, and terrifying calm. They thought they had backed me into an inescapable corner. They thought they had finally broken me. They had absolutely no idea that I was just waiting for them to put all of their criminal intent on the record. The silence inside the subterranean VIP cabin stretched out, becoming dense and toxic. The soundproof acoustic paneling that lined the walls swallowed every breath and rustle, creating a suffocating vacuum. Thomas was breathing heavily, his knuckles stark white, as he gripped the edge of the black marble table. Spencer looked like a cornered rat, sweating profusely, while Gavin and Jasmine wore matching expressions of smug anticipation, completely convinced that their pathetic blackmail threat had secured their ultimate victory. They stood united in their depravity, a pack of rabid vultures, waiting for the wounded prey to finally bleed out and surrender. But it was my mother who recognized that the psychological breaking point had not yet been reached. Cynthia saw the unwavering calm in my eyes and interpreted it as mere defiance rather than absolute control. She stepped out from the shadows of the room, pushing past Thomas and Spencer with an air of lethal authority. Her stilettos clicked sharply against the hardwood floor, echoing like the ticking of a metronome, counting down the final seconds of their empire. She stopped directly across from me, bracing her manicured hands on the table. Cynthia's face was completely devoid of maternal warmth. It was a mask of cold, calculating cruelty, perfectly sculpted by decades of high society ruthlessness. She looked at the jagged burn scars proudly displayed across my back and shoulders, her upper lip curling into a sneer of profound disgust. She had always viewed my survival as an ugly stain on her pristine legacy, and now she was preparing to explicitly weaponize that deeply held resentment. "You are incredibly selfish, Blair," Cynthia began, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper that somehow commanded the entire room. "You sit here acting as though we owe you something, as though this family has not burdened itself with your existence for far too long. But we both know the truth about what happened 12 years ago, don't we?" I did not blink. I kept my gaze locked onto hers, allowing her to dig the trench as deep as she possibly could. "You were supposed to die that night," Cynthia stated the horrific words, leaving her mouth with chilling mechanical precision. "When that fire consumed the summer house, it was supposed to be a tragedy. A neat, tidy, unfortunate accident that would have garnered us endless high society sympathy and completely erased the defective, disappointing daughter from our perfect family portrait. But you just had to survive. You clawed your way out of the ashes, completely ruined, horribly disfigured, and forced us to spend the next decade looking at a walking, talking monument to failure. Your survival was nothing but a grotesque glitch in our lives." The sheer malice radiating from her was almost tangible, but I felt absolutely no pain. The little girl who would have wept at those words had died a long time ago, replaced by the architect of their impending destruction. "We paid for your extensive surgeries," Cynthia continued, her voice rising in pitch, practically vibrating with indignant fury. "We hid you away so you would not humiliate us in front of our peers. We gave you a comfortable life when you should have been a pile of ashes in the dirt. You owe us, Blair. You owe us for every single breath you have taken over the last 12 years. This is the debt of your survival. You will pick up that pen, you will sign that confession, and you will march into a federal prison to take the fall for your brother. It is the absolute least you can do to repay this family for the immense inconvenience of keeping you alive." Thomas nodded in grim agreement, his jaw set with ruthless determination. Spencer let out a long breath, visibly relieved that our mother had delivered the ultimate psychological blow. Gavin and Jasmine smirked, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle of my supposed demolition. They expected me to shatter into a million pieces. They expected me to scream, to break down into hysterical sobs, to violently reject the horrific cruelty of my own mother's admission. They expected me to finally surrender to their manufactured authority. I did not yell. I did not shed a single tear. I did not even break eye contact. Instead, I reached into the hidden side pocket of my crimson silk gown and slowly withdrew my heavily encrypted smartphone. I rested my hand on the cold black marble, holding the device loosely. The screen illuminated, casting a faint digital glow against my face, highlighting the absolute serenity in my expression. "You are entirely right about one thing, Mother," I said, my voice ringing with a lethal, icy calm that caused the smug smiles to instantly vanish from their faces. "I did survive. And it is finally time to pay the debt." I stared dead into Cynthia's eyes, watching the very first microscopic flicker of confusion and primal fear register in her pupils. Without looking down, I tapped a single highly secured button on my screen. The execution of Elias's master protocol was instantaneous and breathtakingly violent. Inside the soundproof VIP cabin, the large digital monitors mounted on the acoustic walls flickered and died. A split second later, a heavy, muffled thud vibrated through the floorboards, indicating that the yacht's massive central entertainment framework had been violently overridden. The lively, upbeat classical music from the string quartet performing for the socialites on the upper decks was completely severed. In its place, a deafening, ear-piercing screech of audio feedback blasted through every single high-fidelity speaker on the multi-million-dollar vessel. The agonizing sound lasted for precisely 3 seconds, paralyzing the entire party before plunging the yacht into an ominous, heavy silence. Then the visual hijack commenced. Every single smart screen on the ship, the massive outdoor theater displays by the infinity pools, the digital menus at the luxury bars, the navigational monitors on the bridge, the interactive mirrors in the restrooms, and the large televisions mounted inside our claustrophobic vault simultaneously flared back to life. They were no longer displaying the glittering promotional materials and fake investment portfolios for Spencer's fabricated mega project. Instead, the screens plunged into a deep, impenetrable black. A stark, brilliant geometric emblem burned onto every display, illuminating the dim cabin with a harsh, glowing light. It was the undeniable, imposing logo of Cipher Core, the insignia of the anonymous shadow conglomerate that now held their entire world hostage, was glaring down at them from their own walls, broadcasting to every elite investor on the ship. Thomas physically recoiled from the table, his face draining of all color as he stared at the glowing monitor above me. Spencer let out a strangled, terrified gasp, taking a panicked, stumbling step backward. Gavin and Jasmine froze, their eyes darting frantically around the room as the inescapable reality of the situation began to crush them. The isolated soundproof room was no longer their interrogation chamber. It was my absolute domain. I smoothly placed my hands on the black marble and pushed myself up, rising to my full height. The crimson silk of my gown pooled around me, the jagged scars on my back standing as a fierce, undeniable testament to the fire they had just tried to weaponize against me. The digital trap was securely locked, the guillotine was raised, and there was absolutely nowhere left to run. Showtime. I did not wait for my family to recover from their technological paralysis. I simply turned on my heel and walked directly toward the heavy, reinforced door of the subterranean cabin. The magnetic lock disengaged with a sharp metallic clack, perfectly timed by Elias, who was monitoring my every physical movement through the ship's hacked security grid. I pushed the door open and stepped out of the stifling vault, leaving my parents and my brother temporarily entombed in their own shock. The cool, conditioned air in the corridor was a welcome relief. Behind me, the spell finally broke. I heard Thomas roar my name, his voice cracking with unprecedented panic, followed by the heavy, frantic footsteps of Spencer and Gavin scrambling to pursue me. I did not run. I ascended the glass spiral staircase with the measured, regal pace of a woman who owned the ground she walked on. When I emerged onto the main deck, the atmosphere had completely transformed. The previously vibrant high society masquerade had descended into a sea of absolute bewilderment. Hundreds of Manhattan's most ruthless venture capitalists, hedge fund managers, and prominent socialites stood frozen, holding their crystal flutes of vintage champagne. They were staring in profound confusion at the massive LED displays towering over the infinity pools. The glowing geometric emblem of Cipher Core pulsed silently across every single screen, replacing the fabricated branding of Spencer's fraudulent mega project. The string quartet stood awkwardly, holding their instruments, completely silenced by the overarching digital hijack. The only sound remaining was the crashing of the ocean waves against the hull. "Blair, stop right there!" Thomas bellowed, bursting out of the lower deck access doors with Spencer, Gavin, Cynthia, and Jasmine right on his heels. They lunged forward, desperate to physically tackle me, to wrestle my phone away, to violently silence the destruction of their empire. They did not make it past the threshold. Instantly, a dozen members of the yacht's hospitality staff dropped their silver trays and discarded their white linen napkins. The bartenders, the waitstaff, and the unassuming deckhands moved with immediate, synchronized military precision. They were Elias's undercover security operatives, seamlessly integrated into the event staff days in advance. They formed an impenetrable human wall of solid muscle, violently shoving Thomas and Spencer backward. Spencer attempted to throw a wild, desperate punch, but a waiter effortlessly caught his wrist, twisted his arm behind his back, and slammed his face against the polished teak bulkhead. A female operative disguised as a sommelier firmly blocked Cynthia and Jasmine, stepping directly into their path with a cold, unyielding glare. My family was physically contained, trapped like caged animals while I walked freely across the deck. I approached the elevated DJ booth positioned at the bow of the yacht. The hired DJ stood paralyzed, terrified by the sudden hostile takeover of his expensive equipment. I extended my hand, and he immediately surrendered the wireless microphone, stepping back into the shadows. I walked to the absolute center of the main stage, the ocean wind catching the crimson silk of my gown, sending it snapping around my ankles like a living flame. I tapped the microphone twice. The sharp percussive thumps echoed across the bay, commanding the undivided attention of every single billionaire and corporate titan on the vessel. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice projecting smoothly through the yacht's massive surround sound system. "I apologize for the sudden interruption to your festivities, but we have an incredibly important corporate update to share regarding your host this evening. I raised my hand and signaled to the cameras I knew Elias was actively watching. The towering LED screens behind me instantly shifted. The Cipher Core logo dissolved and was immediately replaced by high-resolution scans of heavily redacted legal documents. They were the absolute transfer papers for Spencer's $15 million cartel debt. The documents clearly outlined the immediate calling of the principal and the absolute seizure of all Wilson manufacturing assets. The massive screens zoomed in aggressively, focusing on the bottom right corner of the digital paperwork. The signature of the anonymous shadow conglomerate CEO was magnified 1,000 times, burning brightly against the night sky. It was my full legal name in stark, undeniable black and white. The collective gasp from the crowd was a physical wave of sound. Heads whipped back and forth between the towering screens and my figure standing on the stage. The elite investors who had just spent the last 2 hours shaking Spencer's hand and considering astronomical investments in his project were now staring at the undeniable proof of his complete subjugation. I am the sole owner and chief executive officer of Cipher Core, I declared, projecting my words with crystal clarity. I am the shadow entity that just purchased every single ounce of debt belonging to Wilson Manufacturing. I paced slowly across the stage, making sure my voice reached every corner of the lavish vessel. You are all invited here tonight to invest in a visionary real estate mega project. You were promised revolutionary returns and unparalleled growth by a family that claims to represent the pinnacle of business elite. I am standing here to inform you that you have been aggressively lied to. There is no mega project. There are no building permits. There is no legitimate foundation. My brother Spencer and his associates have spent the last 3 years running a massive, highly illegal money laundering syndicate for offshore cartels. They embezzled millions, creating fraudulent ledgers to hide their catastrophic losses. The Wilson family empire is completely, entirely, and irreversibly bankrupt. The murmurs among the elite crowd mutated into shouts of outrage and shock. Investors began pulling out their phones, frantically dialing their wealth managers and legal teams. I pointed a manicured finger directly at the polished deck beneath our feet. This very yacht, the vintage champagne you are currently drinking, the beluga caviar you just consumed, it was all purchased with stolen illicit funds. I revealed, my voice slicing through the rising panic of the crowd. You are currently floating in the middle of the bay on a monumental crime scene. They lured you out into international waters to drain your accounts and use your clean money to pay off the violent criminals breathing down their necks. They thought they could use your wealth to buy their salvation. Instead, they have dragged all of you into the center of a catastrophic federal financial investigation. Welcome to the real Wilson legacy. The uproar that followed my announcement was a deafening wave of manic energy that swept across the sprawling teak deck of the superyacht. Wealthy investors who had just been sipping vintage champagne were now frantically shouting into their cell phones, screaming at their wealth managers and legal teams to freeze all assets connected to Wilson Manufacturing. The immaculate masquerade ball had instantly devolved into a spectacular riot of self-preservation. Panic is a highly contagious disease among the elite, and I stood at the epicenter of the outbreak, watching the infection spread with absolute clarity. But the financial decimation of their empire was only the foundation of my meticulously designed trap. Thomas and Spencer cared about money, but they cared about their image and their fragile egos above all else. It was time to systematically dismantle the rest of their pathetic reality. I tapped the screen of my smartphone a second time, signaling Elias to initiate the next phase of the broadcast. The massive LED displays towering over the infinity pools blinked. The stark black and white financial dossiers, the offshore routing numbers, and the cartel debt ledgers dissolved into a sea of digital static. The harsh corporate reality was suddenly replaced by crystal-clear high-definition video footage. The visuals were shockingly bright, flooding the dark deck with the intimate lighting of a luxury Manhattan penthouse. The crowd of panicked billionaires and socialites momentarily halted their frantic phone calls, their attention violently hijacked by the towering screens. The footage was captured directly from the hidden security cameras installed inside Spencer and Jasmine's private residence. It was a multi-angle compilation of pure, unadulterated betrayal. The screens displayed Jasmine and Gavin tangled together on the expensive imported Italian leather sofa that Spencer had proudly purchased just months prior. There was absolutely no room for deniability. The 4K resolution captured every single agonizing detail of their long-term affair. The video cut to different dates and different rooms, the kitchen, the private terrace, and the master bedroom, exposing a timeline of infidelity that stretched back for the better part of a year. The sheer brazenness of their actions playing out on 50-foot screens in the middle of a maritime gala sent a collective, horrified gasp rippling through the crowd of hundreds. The financial ruin had induced terror, but this deeply personal humiliation was a different kind of spectacle entirely. Dozens of smartphones were suddenly raised into the air, recording the towering displays immortalizing the Wilson family's ultimate degradation. But corporate espionage and digital surveillance are rarely limited to just video. As the footage of their vile affair played, a rapid sequence of text message bubbles began to overlay the screens. The graphics were magnified to a massive scale, ensuring that even the guests standing near the aft deck could read every single word. These were the highly encrypted messages Gavin and Jasmine had exchanged on their supposedly secure shadow network. The crowd fell into a stunned, breathless silence as they read the meticulously typed plot to rob my brother blind. The digital thread laid out their entire conspiracy with terrifying precision. Gavin's messages appeared in bright blue text. "The moment Spencer takes the fall for the missing funds, we trigger the sweep. I have the backdoor access to the secondary offshore accounts." He is too panicked to notice the routing changes. Jasmine's responses popped up in sharp white text right beside her lover's words. "I already booked the private charter out of Teterboro to Zurich under the alias accounts. Let his father try to clean up the mess with the feds. As long as Spencer goes down, we take the 15 million and disappear. He is so stupid he actually thinks I am worried about his reputation." I watched the text thread scroll upward, exposing every detail of their exit strategy. They had discussed flight paths, non-extradition treaties, and the exact distribution of the stolen cartel money. They had been aggressively manipulating Spencer, feeding his paranoia, and encouraging him to force me into signing that fake confession in the VIP room. They needed a scapegoat to keep the authorities and the cartel distracted long enough for them to empty the remaining shadow accounts and vanish into the Swiss Alps. They had played the entire Wilson family for absolute fools, using my brother's arrogant blindness as a shield for their own illicit extraction plan. I lowered the microphone from my face and turned my gaze toward the center of the deck where my family was still physically pinned by my undercover operatives. Spencer had completely stopped struggling against the waiter holding his arm behind his back. The violent manic energy that had driven him out of the lower decks had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, shattered shell of a man. His jaw was slack, his face drained of every ounce of blood, making his skin look like gray parchment under the harsh glare of the LED screens. He was staring up at the towering displays, watching his beautiful trophy wife and his trusted business partner coordinate his absolute destruction. His eyes tracked the text messages detailing how thoroughly they despised him, how easily they planned to leave him to face the wrath of federal investigators and international crime syndicates. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He was not the brilliant, untouchable heir to a manufacturing dynasty. He was the mark. He was the disposable pawn in his wife's getaway plan. The fragile, arrogant ego he had cultivated his entire life fractured and collapsed in real time. Jasmine was screaming hysterically, trying to cover her face with her hands, but the female operative gripping her shoulders held her firmly in place, forcing her to stand in the glaring spotlight of her own treachery. The arrogant sneer she had worn in the VIP room when she called me a useless throwaway was entirely gone, replaced by the panicked sobbing of a woman who knew her life of luxury was permanently over. She looked wildly towards Spencer, trying to formulate a lie, attempting to somehow deny the 50-foot high-definition evidence illuminating the night sky, but Spencer refused to look at her. Gavin was faring even worse. The cowardly tech architect was actively trembling, his knees buckling beneath his expensive tuxedo. He was staring out at the sea of wealthy investors, realizing that his face and his treason were currently being broadcast to every major player in Manhattan. He had plotted to steal from the very cartels he was supposed to be hiding money for. The men in the dark suits who operated in the shadows would see this broadcast. They would know exactly who had tried to hijack their funds. Gavin was a dead man walking, and the stark terror in his eyes confirmed he knew exactly what awaited him. I raised the microphone back to my lips, the ocean wind sweeping my hair across my face as I addressed the paralyzed crowd. Corporate fraud is one thing, I stated, my voice cutting through the stunned whispers and the crashing waves. But as you can clearly see, the Wilson family is fundamentally bankrupt on every conceivable level. They invited you here to steal your wealth to cover the debts they incurred while stealing from each other. They are a monument to greed, wrapped in imported silk and paid for with dirty money. I turned my back on the giant screens and looked directly at Thomas, who was staring at his ruined children with an expression of sheer apocalyptic horror. The mask of the distinguished patriarch had melted away, leaving an old, defeated man standing in the wreckage of his own hubris. The absolute decimation of their social and financial standing was complete, but the night was far from over. The trap was fully sprung, and the real authorities were already on their way. The paralyzing silence that had gripped the yacht's main deck shattered into a million jagged pieces. Absolute pandemonium erupted with the ferocity of a detonated bomb. The initial shock of the elite crowd instantly mutated into aggressive, unfiltered outrage. Manhattan's most powerful investors, men and women who dictated global markets and commanded absolute respect, completely abandoned their refined decorum. They surged forward, shouting furiously at my family, demanding immediate restitution and threatening catastrophic legal retaliation. Flutes of champagne were hurled onto the teak deck, shattering near my father's expensive leather shoes. The collective roar of hundreds of betrayed billionaires created a deafening, chaotic symphony. It was the glorious, chaotic soundtrack of the Wilson Empire burning to the ground. My undercover operative smoothly stepped back, melting into the periphery of the crowd, allowing the furious mob of socialites to become the new physical barrier trapping my family on the stage. Spencer remained frozen for only a fraction of a second longer. The realization of his absolute ruin finally cracked the last remaining barrier of his fragile sanity. His eyes, violently bloodshot and bulging, darted from the massive LED screens, displaying his wife's infidelity to the terrified face of his best friend and business partner. The ultimate payoff of their unchecked greed had arrived, and it demanded a physical toll. A primal, guttural roar tore from Spencer's throat, completely devoid of human articulation. He launched himself across the deck, moving with the reckless, desperate velocity of a wild animal. Gavin barely had time to raise his hands in a futile gesture of defense before Spencer collided with him. The impact was brutal and completely uncoordinated. Spencer tackled Gavin around the midsection, using his forward momentum to drive them both backward. They crashed violently into the centerpiece of the gala, a towering, meticulously constructed 8-foot pyramid of vintage champagne glasses. The collision was spectacular. Hundreds of crystal flutes exploded simultaneously, sending a blinding shower of sharp glass and sticky, expensive alcohol raining down across the polished deck. The deafening crash of the shattering tower temporarily overpowered the screaming crowd. Spencer and Gavin tumbled into the wreckage, thrashing wildly in a puddle of spilled champagne and broken crystal. Spencer threw blind, frenzied punches, striking Gavin in the jaw and the ribs, while Gavin shrieked in pain, throwing his arms over his face to protect himself from the flying glass and his brother-in-law's unhinged wrath. The bespoke tuxedos they wore were instantly shredded and soaked in alcohol, reducing the two arrogant architects of the cartel conspiracy to a pair of pathetic, brawling thugs. Jasmine scrambled backward frantically, trying to avoid the flying shards of crystal. Her expensive designer gown was splattered with champagne, and her perfectly styled hair was coming undone in the salty ocean wind. She looked at her husband pummeling her lover on the deck, and then she looked at the hundreds of glowing smartphone lenses pointed directly at her face. The socialites she had spent years desperately trying to impress were now actively documenting her ultimate degradation. Survival instinct, the only genuine trait Jasmine possessed, instantly took over. She began to shriek, her voice shrill and piercing, cutting through the chaos. She pointed a trembling finger at Gavin, who was currently bleeding on the teak floorboards. "He forced me," Jasmine wailed, performing a desperate theatrical display of victimhood. "Gavin manipulated me into doing this. He brainwashed me. He threatened to ruin me if I did not help him steal the money. I never wanted to hurt Spencer. It was all Gavin." It was a spectacular performance, but it was entirely futile. Her pathetic shrieks were met with mocking laughter and disgusted sneers from the crowd. The massive screens above her were still glaringly illuminating the specific text messages where she explicitly called her husband stupid and eagerly planned to abandon him. No amount of fake tears could wash away the digital proof of her absolute complicity. She realized her lies were falling on deaf ears, and her shrieks dissolved into genuine panicked sobbing. She collapsed onto a deck chair, pulling her knees to her chest, completely broken by the public annihilation of her fabricated identity. Through the absolute carnage, my eyes found Thomas and Cynthia. The formidable patriarch and the untouchable matriarch of the Wilson family were entirely paralyzed. They did not attempt to stop the violent brawl between their son and his partner. They did not try to silence Jasmine's hysterical screaming. They stood frozen in the center of the wreckage, completely overwhelmed by the sheer velocity of their destruction. The pristine, spotless reputation they had spent decades ruthlessly cultivating, the legacy they had valued far above my own life, was being publicly slaughtered. Dozens of high society influencers and corporate titans were explicitly aiming their phone cameras at my parents, capturing every second of their humiliation. Thomas raised his trembling hands, desperately trying to shield his face from the relentless flashing lights. His shoulders were hunched, his posture entirely defeated. He looked incredibly small, pathetic, and stripped of all his manufactured power. Cynthia was frantic, holding her expensive jeweled clutch over her eyes, trying to hide her face from the very people she had spent her entire life trying to dominate. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving as the socialites she considered her peers openly spat insults in her direction. The sheer public spectacle of their ruin was a punishment far worse than any physical pain they could have endured. They were being actively erased from the only world that mattered to them. I stood perfectly still at the edge of the DJ booth, watching the masterpiece of their downfall unfold with cold, detached satisfaction. The air was thick with the smell of spilled alcohol, panic, and shattered egos. But beneath the shouting of the investors and the sound of breaking glass, a new, distinct noise began to cut through the night air. It was a sharp, piercing sound echoing across the dark, choppy waters of the bay. I turned my gaze out toward the impenetrable black horizon. In the distance, cutting through the darkness, were the urgent, rhythmic flashes of red and blue lights. The wailing sirens of multiple marine police interceptor boats were growing steadily louder, tearing through the maritime silence. They were moving at maximum velocity, zeroing in on the exact coordinates of the superyacht. The authorities had received the encrypted data packets Elias had transmitted to the Federal Cybercrimes Division, perfectly timed with the start of my broadcast. The trap had effectively closed. The private floating fortress my family had used to mask their crimes was about to be boarded by heavily armed federal agents. Their empire was gone, their reputation was annihilated, and their freedom was about to officially expire. The piercing wail of the sirens mutated from a distant threat into a deafening physical force. The dark, choppy waters of the bay churned violently as three massive tactical interceptor vessels belonging to the Marine Police aggressively flanked the superyacht. Blinding halogen spotlights mounted on the police boats cut through the maritime darkness, sweeping over the shattered remains of the Champagne Tower and the brawling cowards on the teak deck. Heavy grappling lines clanked against the pristine white hull, securing the vessels together. Heavily armed tactical officers clad in dark Kevlar vests and tactical helmets swarmed over the railings with synchronized, terrifying military precision. "Federal agents, nobody move, keep your hands where we can see them." The authoritative command echoed through the yacht's massive surround sound system, completely overriding the crashing ocean waves and the residual panic of the masquerade ball. The sheer show of overwhelming organized force instantly paralyzed the entire deck. The elite investors, venture capitalists, and hedge fund managers who had been screaming for their lawyers just moments prior immediately complied. Billionaires and socialites dropped to their knees or pressed themselves against the glass bulkheads, raising their trembling hands in the air, desperately trying to physically distance themselves from the radioactive contamination of the Wilson family. The violent brawl at the center of the deck froze instantaneously. Spencer and Gavin, still entangled in the sticky puddle of expensive champagne and broken crystal, stopped mid-punch. Spencer's fist hovered mere inches from Gavin's bleeding face, his knuckles white with strain. The tactical team moved in rapidly, their heavy boots crunching loudly over the destroyed glass, forming a tight, impenetrable perimeter around the ruined men. My undercover operatives, who had flawlessly maintained the containment line until this exact second, seamlessly stepped back into the shadows, relinquishing control to the incoming federal strike force. A stern, broad-shouldered police chief strode onto the main deck, flanked by two senior agents wearing crisp FBI windbreakers. He carried a thick, heavy stack of manila folders, completely unaffected by the extreme wealth, the designer gowns, or the extravagant luxury surrounding him. He looked down at Spencer and Gavin with an expression of absolute professional disgust as the two men scrambled to their feet, slipping pathetically on the wet, alcohol-soaked teak. "Spencer Wilson and Gavin Hayes," the chief barked, his voice carrying the lethal weight of absolute authority. "I am executing federal arrest warrants for you both. The charges include massive international money laundering, systemic wire fraud, and direct conspiracy to commit financial crimes on behalf of recognized offshore cartels. A multi-agency task force has been tracking your shadow ledgers for months, and tonight your operation is officially terminated." Thomas, who had been watching his entire legacy evaporate in a state of catatonic shock, suddenly broke his paralysis. The ruthless survival instinct of a cornered patriarch violently kicked in. He shoved past Cynthia, nearly knocking her over in his frantic haste, and lunged toward the police chief. The tactical officers instantly raised their weapons, but Thomas threw his hands up in a desperate, pleading gesture. "Officer, wait! There is a massive, catastrophic misunderstanding here," Thomas begged, his voice cracking, dripping with a sickening blend of panic and desperate authority. He was trying to salvage his golden boy one last time, even if it meant stepping on a corpse to do it. Thomas pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at Gavin, who was clutching his bruised ribs and spitting blood onto the deck. "My son is a victim here. He was completely manipulated," Thomas yelled, his face slick with sweat. "This man, Gavin Hayes, is the sole architect of this entire fraud. He managed the offshore accounts. He ran the shadow networks. Spencer had absolutely no idea the funds were illicit. Gavin used his position as the tech lead to orchestrate this entire syndicate behind our backs to fund his own illicit affairs." Gavin stared at Thomas in absolute visceral horror. The coward realized in real time that he was being served up as the sacrificial lamb to save the Wilson bloodline. The loyalty he thought he had earned by managing their dirty money and sleeping with Spencer's wife meant absolutely nothing. "You lying bastard," Gavin spat, coughing up a mixture of blood and champagne. "You knew everything. You all knew." Jasmine remained huddled on her deck chair, sobbing into her hands, refusing to look at either the husband she had betrayed or the lover who was now being thrown to the wolves. She simply rocked back and forth, watching her fabricated reality burn to ash. The federal agents completely ignored the pathetic, bickering criminals. The chief nodded to his men, and they stepped forward, heavy metal handcuffs glinting under the harsh halogen spotlights. They grabbed Spencer's wrists, yanking them aggressively behind his back, preparing to secure him and drag him off his own luxury vessel. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I stepped off the elevated DJ booth, the crimson silk of my gown snapping fiercely in the ocean wind, and walked directly into the center of the tactical formation. I locked eyes with the police chief, projecting an aura of absolute, terrifying control. "Wait!" I commanded, my voice ringing out with lethal, undeniable clarity, forcing the federal agents to halt their movements. I looked at Thomas, whose face was still twisted in desperate betrayal, and then shifted my gaze to Spencer, who was trembling violently in the agent's grip. I was saving the final, most devastating blow for this exact second. We aren't just here for white-collar crimes. I pulled a sleek titanium smartphone from the hidden pocket of my crimson gown. The screen glowed with a single isolated audio file. Elias had spent 18 agonizing months decrypting this fragmented recording, recovering it from a scorched black box security drive I had painstakingly tracked down through a labyrinth of international data brokers. I held the device high in the air so everyone could see it. The federal agents trained to secure the scene hesitated, reading the absolute gravity in my posture. The police chief narrowed his eyes, his hand resting on his tactical belt, but he gave a sharp nod, signaling his men to hold their positions and allow me to proceed. I pressed play. The superyacht's state-of-the-art acoustic system, previously used to pipe delicate string symphonies across the deck, now broadcasted an absolute nightmare. A horrific, visceral hissing filled the crisp night air. It was the unmistakable, terrifying crackle of a raging chemical fire. The sound was raw, unfiltered, and deafening, tearing through the premium speakers with a violent intensity that made several guests physically flinch and cover their ears. The wealthy onlookers, already shaken by the financial ruin and the marital scandals, were now plunged into an entirely different realm of terror. Then came the voices. 12 years of buried trauma resurrected in high-definition audio. I did not mean to do it. Spencer's voice echoed across the black water. It was not the voice of the arrogant venture capitalist standing in handcuffs today, but the panicked, drug-addled shrieking of a reckless 20-year-old boy. The chemicals, I just knocked the tray over, it went up so fast. Dad, the whole lab is going to burn. I am going to prison. The recorded audio captured the sickening sound of shattering glass, exploding pressurized canisters, and collapsing structural beams. The past was actively bleeding into the present. Spencer, currently pinned by the federal agents, suddenly went entirely limp. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a freshly exhumed corpse under the harsh halogen police lights. He knew exactly what audio was playing. He knew exactly what was coming next. "Shut up and help me with this cabinet," Thomas's voice boomed through the speakers. It was younger, but carried the exact same ruthless, tyrannical cadence he had used his entire life to bully the world into submission. The audio picked up the heavy, agonizing scrape of solid oak and metal being dragged across a tiled floor. It was the sound of my father grunting with intense physical exertion, actively barricading the reinforced door to the eastern wing of the research facility. The wing I was trapped inside. A collective violent shudder ripped through the hundreds of elite guests. The champagne flutes that had not been shattered in the previous brawl now slipped from numb fingers, thudding and breaking onto the deck. The absolute horror of the situation was dawning on the crowd. They were not listening to a boardroom dispute. They were listening to a family actively engineering a tragedy, but the most chilling moment was yet to come. Over the roar of the digital flames and Spencer's continued pathetic blubbering, a third voice cut through the chaos. It was Cynthia. Her tone was not panicked. It was not hysterical. It was crystal clear, unnervingly calm, and utterly soulless. "Leave it." Thomas pushed the filing cabinet against the handle. "If the authorities find the accelerants near Spencer, his life is over. We can't risk losing our son." There was a beat of silence on the recording, a momentary, agonizing pause, where a mother actively chose to sacrifice one child to save another. And then the audio delivered the final, devastating blow. From behind the barricaded door on the recording, muffled, agonizing screams began to echo. They were my screams. The desperate, terrified shrieks of an 18-year-old girl begging for her parents to open the door, pounding her fists against the heavy oak as the thick, toxic smoke filled her lungs, and the fire consumed the walls around her. The sheer, raw terror in that younger version of my voice was paralyzing. "Mom, Dad, help me. The door is stuck. Please, I am burning." The recording played out its horrific conclusion. The agonizing screams, eventually drowned out by the roar of the collapsing roof before cutting off into a sharp, dead digital silence. The silence on the yacht was even more profound. It was a suffocating, horrifying void. The ocean breeze seemed to vanish. The elite echelons of Manhattan society, people who thrived on scandal and ruthless business tactics, were rendered completely mute, their faces masks of pure visceral revulsion. White-collar fraud was a game they understood. It was a risk factored into their portfolios. This, however, was a profound, unfathomable evil. They were staring at Thomas, Cynthia, and Spencer not as failed business partners, but as absolute monsters. Cynthia had fallen to her knees. She was staring blankly at the speakers, her hands covering her mouth, her perfectly preserved facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The monstrous reality of her own words broadcast to the world had finally broken her mind. Thomas stood frozen, his chest heaving, his eyes wide and vacant as he stared at the deck. He had spent 12 years building an empire on the ashes of what he thought was my grave, and now the ghost had returned to drag him into the abyss. The police chief, a veteran law enforcement officer who had maintained a stony, unreadable expression throughout the initial raid, slowly turned his head to look at me. His jaw clenched so tight the muscles twitched. The folders containing the financial warrants lowered slightly to his side. He then shifted his gaze toward my parents, his eyes hardening into twin chips of flint. The atmosphere among the tactical officers shifted instantly. The professional detachment required for a corporate bust evaporated, replaced by the grim, focused intensity reserved for violent criminals. I survived. I stated, my voice steady, carrying none of the fear from the recording breaking the heavy silence. And I spent the last 12 years gathering the proof. They locked the door. They left me to burn so their golden boy would not face a narcotics and arson charge. The chief turned fully toward Thomas, Cynthia, and Spencer. He signaled the surrounding agents with a sharp, decisive hand gesture. The officers moved in with renewed aggressive purpose, their hands dropping to their utility belts. The parameters of this raid have just drastically changed, the chief announced, his voice booming over the deck, carrying the absolute weight of justice long denied. You are no longer being detained solely for corporate espionage, wire fraud, or cartel money laundering. He stepped directly into Thomas's personal space, forcing the broken patriarch to look him in the eye. Thomas Wilson, Cynthia Wilson, and Spencer Wilson. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, arson, and the attempted murder of your own daughter. You have the right to remain silent, and I highly suggest you start using it immediately. The metallic ratcheting of heavy steel handcuffs echoed across the deck, snapping shut around my father's wrists. Cynthia was hauled to her feet, sobbing uncontrollably as an agent secured her arms behind her back. The high society crowd watched in disgusted awe as the charge just upgraded from fraud to attempted murder and conspiracy. The federal agents did not afford them the dignity of a private exit. They were aggressively paraded down the grand glass spiral staircase and across the illuminated gangway. Their bespoke designer clothes ruined their faces, exposed to the merciless glare of the police strobes and the relentless flashes of 100 smartphone cameras recording their downfall. Spencer was a weeping, blubbering mess. The arrogant venture capitalist had completely shattered his legs, giving out twice as heavily armored agents physically dragged him toward the awaiting marine transport. He was no longer the untouchable golden heir. He was a convicted arsonist, facing a lifetime behind bars, whimpering for a mother who could no longer protect him. Thomas and Cynthia followed, their wrists bound tightly in cold steel. The invincible patriarch looked hollowed out, staring blankly at the teak deck, calculating the exact moment his legacy vaporized. The federal warrants I had provided ensured that by the time their expensive shoes touched the dock, every single bank account, offshore trust, and shell corporation tied to the Wilson name was frozen and seized by the government. Decades in a federal penitentiary awaited them for their conspiracy. They were penniless, disgraced, and utterly ruined. Nearby, Gavin and Jasmine were violently shoved into the cramped back seat of a Marine patrol cruiser. Stripped of the $15 million they had conspired to steal, the illusion of their toxic romance instantly evaporated. They turned on each other with vicious, venomous hatred. Jasmine screamed that Gavin had ruined her life, thrashing against her restraints to claw at him, while Gavin spat curses right back, blaming her insatiable greed for their capture. They were two parasitic creatures trapped in a cage, tearing each other apart for scraps as the police boats sped away into the darkness. The chaotic noise of the marina eventually faded, replaced by the sterile, humming silence of a federal holding facility. I stood in the observation corridor, watching through the thick two-way glass as my mother paced the cramped gray interrogation room. She wore an oversized orange jumpsuit that clashed violently with her remaining cosmetic enhancements. the federal prosecutor had allowed me exactly 5 minutes. I opened the heavy metal door and stepped inside. The air was stale and tasted of cheap bleach. Cynthia stopped pacing the moment the heavy latch clicked shut. Her eyes, usually so sharp and calculating, were bloodshot and desperate. She rushed toward the steel table bolted to the floor, reaching out with shackled hands, as if she wanted to embrace me. "Blair," she sobbed, her voice trembling with a pathetic manufactured attempt at maternal warmth. "You have to stop this. You have to talk to the prosecutors. They are taking absolutely everything. We are your family. Blood is thicker than water, sweetheart. You cannot let your own flesh and blood rot in a cage. We made a terrible mistake, but we love you." I did not flinch. I did not move. I looked at the woman who had given birth to me, stripping away every ounce of residual emotion until all that remained was pure, absolute clinical detachment. I let her desperate pleas hang in the cold, unforgiving air, forcing her to endure the heavy, suffocating silence of the interrogation room. "I can't risk losing myself," I stated, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy. "You did not make a mistake, Cynthia. You made a choice. You chose to push a filing cabinet against a reinforced door. You chose to listen to me scream for my life. You left me to die in those flames so your golden boy could keep his trust fund." She recoiled as if I had physically struck her, her mouth opening and closing in silent, terrified shock. "The scared little girl you locked in that burning room died 12 years ago," I continued, my dead eyes boring directly into her soul. "And the woman standing here was born from the ashes. You have absolutely nothing left to offer me." I turned on my heel and walked out. I did not look back as she collapsed against the steel table and began to wail my name, begging for a salvation that would never come. I stepped into the brightly lit corridor, and the heavy metal door slammed shut with a definitive, ringing finality, locking away my past forever. 365 days later, the air tasted entirely different. The stifling, toxic atmosphere of Manhattan high society was a distant memory replaced by the crisp electric energy of Northern California. I stood in the absolute center of my sprawling glass-walled executive headquarters, overlooking the rolling green hills of Silicon Valley. Cipher Corp had expanded far beyond a shadow firm utilized for corporate vengeance. It was now a dominant global technology conglomerate, completely unrivaled in data security and predictive analytics. I held a ceramic mug, the bitter heat of the black coffee grounding me in the present moment. I took a slow sip, looking out over the sprawling campus that bore my actual name. Hundreds of brilliant minds worked beneath me, building the future completely unaware of the ashes this empire was built upon. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the space in a warm, golden glow. It caught the reflection of the glass, casting my image back at me. I was not wearing long sleeves. I was not wearing high collars or thick concealing makeup. For the first time in my adult life, my arms and shoulders were entirely bare. The intricate twisting network of burn scars stretched across my skin, a stark, undeniable map of my survival. I no longer viewed them as a deformity or a mark of shame to be hidden away in the shadows. They were the physical manifestation of my resilience. They were a crown of absolute victory forged in fire and worn with uncompromising pride. The Wilson manufacturing empire was officially liquidated, its assets auctioned off to pay the monumental legal fines and restitution owed to the federal government. Thomas, Cynthia, and Spencer were currently serving consecutive life sentences in maximum security federal penitentiaries, completely isolated from one another, stripped of their names and their power. Gavin and Jasmine had turned state's evidence against the cartels in a desperate bid for reduced sentences, only to find themselves placed in permanent witness protection, living out the rest of their miserable lives looking over their shoulders in perpetual terror. They were gone. The ghosts of my past had been systematically exorcised, locked away in concrete boxes, and digital oblivion. I placed my coffee mug down on the sleek obsidian desk. I was the architect of my own destiny, the absolute master of my reality. I stood alone at the summit, completely untouchable, and for the first time in my entire existence, entirely free. The most profound lesson from Blair's journey is that true self-worth can never be granted by others, especially those who demand your subjugation for their conditional love. We often tether our identities to our family's approval, enduring unacceptable toxicity just to belong. However, this story powerfully illustrates that the ashes of betrayal can become the fertile ground for your greatest triumph. By severing ties with toxic relatives, you free yourself to build an empire of your own design. Never let someone else's inability to value you dictate your destiny. Take a moment to claim your personal power and share your experiences in the comment below.